Hello, I'm Arthur Reed. Welcome to the World War II History Channel, where we explore the pivotal moments and untold stories of the greatest generation. Listen closely, and you can almost hear the dark, amber water whispering to the ancient roots of the cypress trees. Here, in the deep, untamed heart of the Louisiana Bayou, the world moves at a different pace. It is a place of heavy, sweet air, where time seems to stretch and yawn beneath the drooping curtains of Spanish moss. The light does not pierce the canopy here, it filters through, soft and golden, painting quiet shadows that dance upon the surface of the slow-moving water. It is a world that demands patience, a world that holds its secrets tightly in the damp earth and the tangled reeds. If you were to stand on the muddy banks in the fading twilight of those early years, long before the world was consumed by the roar of distant thunders, you would hear only the gentle symphony of the swamp. The rhythmic thrum of the cicadas, the low, distant croak of a bullfrog, and the soft, sloshing sound of a wooden pole pushing against the soft silt of the riverbed. This was the world of Andrew. A restless man, yes, but one whose heart beat in time with the quiet, stubborn rhythm of the natural world around him. He was a man of the woods, a lumberman who understood the silent language spoken by trees. When he ran his calloused, weather-beaten hands over a plank of rough-hewn mahogany or the pale, fragrant wood of a southern pine, he did not just see timber. He felt the life it had lived. He knew how the grain would bend, how it would breathe, how it would yield to the water, and how it would fight the rot. Andrew was a large man, possessed of a booming voice and a fiery spirit, but beneath that blustering exterior was a quiet, almost tender observer of life. He spent his days wandering the edges of the water, his boots sinking into the soft, yielding mud, his eyes always watching. He watched the trappers and the oilmen, the quiet, hard-working people of the bayou who eked out a living in this beautiful, unforgiving landscape. He watched them struggle. The water here was a trickster. It looked wide and inviting, but just beneath the mirrored surface lay hidden shoals, submerged logs, and choking banks of weeds. He saw the local men, their faces lined with exhaustion, their shirts clinging to their backs with sweat, pulling their heavy, deep-drafted skiffs through waters that were often no more than a few inches deep. He saw their quiet frustration when a boat would run aground, the hull grinding sickeningly against a hidden stump. He saw the hours lost, the aching muscles, the silent resignation of men who believed they simply had to accept the harshness of their environment. But Andrew did not believe in accepting things as they were. In the quiet hours of the night, when the rest of the house was asleep and the only sound was the soft patter of rain against the window pane, he would sit at his simple wooden desk. The warm, yellow glow of a kerosene lamp would illuminate the deep creases of concentration on his face. He would take a pencil and a piece of paper, and he would begin to dream. His dreams were not born of grand ambitions or desires for wealth. They were born of a simple, profound empathy for the men he saw struggling in the sun. He wanted to build a boat that did not fight the water, but rather danced with it. A boat that could skim over the shallowest dew, that could bump gently against a submerged log and simply slide over it, like a fallen leaf drifting on the current. He imagined a vessel with a shallow draft, a flat bottom that curved up smoothly at the bow, shaped almost like the belly of a spoon. It was a strange, unconventional idea. The proud shipbuilders of the deep water ports would have laughed at his simple, stubby designs. They believed boats were meant to slice through the waves with sharp, elegant prows, carrying heavy keels that reached deep into the ocean's embrace. But Andrew knew that the deep ocean was a very different world than the muddy, twisting veins of the bayou. He knew that true elegance lay not in appearances, but in harmony with one's surroundings. He poured his heart into those late-night sketches. He thought of the scent of the wood shavings falling to the floor, the comforting, rhythmic sound of a saw biting into timber. He thought of the smiles on the faces of the trappers when they realized they no longer had to break their backs fighting the mud. It was a quiet, everyday heroism, the simple desire of a neighbor trying to make life just a little bit easier for those around him. He began to gather his materials, selecting each piece of wood with the care of a father holding his newborn child. He chose Philippine mahogany for its strength and its resistance to the damp decay of the swamp. He worked with a quiet reverence, his hands guiding the tools with an instinctive grace. There was a profound peace in this labor. In the small, dusty workshop, surrounded by the scent of sap and sawdust, the anxieties of the outside world simply melted away. Here, there were only the beautiful, honest truths of wood, metal, and sweat. He faced setbacks, of course. There were days when the wood splintered, when the angles were wrong, when the quiet voice of doubt whispered in his ear, telling him he was just a foolish lumberman playing at being a shipwright. During these moments, he would simply step outside, stand by the edge of the water, and breathe in the rich, earthy scent of the bayou. He would watch a white egret glide silently over the reeds, its wings barely brushing the tops of the grass. The sheer, effortless grace of the bird would remind him of what he was searching for. A way to move through the world without tearing it apart. A way to float above the obstacles. Sometimes, the most profound stories are the ones hidden in the shadows, just like the quiet secrets of this bayou. History is full of these hidden moments, quiet operations, and unseen heroes that shaped the world we know today, working far away from the spotlight. If you find comfort in uncovering these lost whispers of the past, I would love to invite you to join our email newsletter. As a welcome gift, I'll send you a free copy of our ebook, The Shadow War: 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. Every week, we share deep dives into the forgotten facts and quiet human stories that history almost left behind. It's a wonderful little community of history lovers, and we'd be honored to have you. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As Andrew's first boat began to take shape, a sense of quiet anticipation settled over his small corner of the world. It was a modest thing, smelling strongly of fresh paint and cut timber, resting quietly on the muddy bank. It did not look like a vessel of destiny. It looked like a humble workboat, built by working hands, for working people. When he finally pushed it into the water for the first time, there were no cheering crowds, no brass bands, no breaking of champagne bottles. There was only the gentle splash of the hull meeting the river and the satisfied sigh of a man watching his wooden dream finally learn to swim. He stepped aboard, feeling the boat settle beneath his weight. He started the engine, a low, comforting rumble that vibrated through the wooden deck and into the soles of his boots. As he steered the boat toward the thickest, most tangled part of the swamp, his heart beat a little faster, a quiet drum of hope in his chest. The boat did not falter. It glided forward, its unusual, spoon-shaped bow lifting slightly, skimming over the dark water. When it encountered a hidden log, there was no sickening crunch, no violent jolt. The boat simply tipped its nose up, slid over the obstruction with a gentle scrape of wood against bark, and settled back into the water on the other side, continuing its smooth, unbroken journey. A slow, tired smile spread across Andrew's face. He cut the engine, letting the boat drift aimlessly in the still water. He sat down on the wooden bench, resting his large hands on his knees, and looked up at the canopy of leaves overhead. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, peaceful shadows across the bayou. He had done it. He had built a boat that understood the shallows. He thought of the letters he would write to the men who needed these boats, the simple pride he would feel in delivering a tool that would keep them safe and ease their burdens. He thought of the quiet joy of a job well done. In that fading, golden light, the world felt incredibly small, incredibly safe. There was no way for the lumberman drifting in the Louisiana swamp to know that thousands of miles away, across vast oceans he had never sailed, storm clouds of an unimaginable darkness were beginning to gather. He could not know that the quiet, simple design he had brought to life to help his neighbors would one day be the very thing that would carry the weight of the free world on its wooden shoulders. For now, there was only the twilight, the gentle rocking of the boat, and the soft, sleepy murmur of the bayou settling in for the night. The wood beneath his hands was warm, alive with the fading heat of the day. He closed his eyes, listening to the water lap softly against the hull, a soothing, rhythmic lullaby. He was just a man who loved the wood and the water, resting in the quiet cradle of his own creation, dreaming peaceful dreams in the shadows of the swamp, waiting for the dawn. There is a secret language spoken in the quiet corners of a lumberyard, a gentle dialogue between the warmth of a craftsman's hands and the sleeping grain of the wood. If you were to walk into Andrew Higgins' small boatyard in New Orleans just as the sun began to rise, you would feel this quiet conversation before you ever heard a word. The mornings there were always veiled in a soft, gray fog that rolled lazily off the Mississippi River, dampening the sounds of the waking city and wrapping the yard in a peaceful, almost sacred silence. Before the heavy machinery groaned to life, before the heat of the southern sun baked the earth, there was only the smell. It was a rich, comforting perfume, the sharp, clean scent of fresh-cut pine, the deep, earthy musk of cypress, and the sweet, dark aroma of Philippine mahogany. Andrew would arrive in these solitary, twilight hours. He was a man of large stature, a man whose voice could boom across a crowded room when it needed to, but in the early morning light of the lumberyard, he moved with a surprising, tender grace. He would walk among the stacks of timber, his calloused fingertips brushing lightly against the rough bark and the smooth planks. For Andrew, wood was not simply a material to be bought and sold. It was a living, breathing thing. He believed that every tree carried the memory of the rain that watered it, the wind that bent its branches, and the earth that anchored its roots. To build a boat was not to conquer the wood, but to ask it to continue its journey in a new form. In these early days, long before the shadow of war darkened the horizon, the boats Andrew built were not meant for grand battles or distant oceans. They were meant for the bayous, the twisting, shallow, unpredictable veins of water that pulsed through southern Louisiana. The men who navigated these waters were trappers, oil prospectors, and fishermen. They were quiet, resilient men whose faces were lined by the sun and whose hands were as tough as the leather they wore. These men faced a daily, silent struggle. The swamps were treacherous. A sudden drop in the water level, a hidden mudbank, or a submerged, rotting log could trap a deep-drafted boat for hours, or even days. It was a lonely, frightening feeling to be stranded in the deep marsh as the daylight faded and the eerie, nocturnal symphony of the swamp began. Andrew listened to their stories. He saw the weariness in their shoulders when they returned from a long, troubled expedition. He felt a deep, profound empathy for their quiet hardships, and he wanted, simply, to make their heavy loads a little lighter. And so, he began to craft the Eureka boat. It was a strange, humble-looking vessel. It did not have the sleek, piercing bow of a traditional speedboat. Instead, it had a shallow draft and a blunt, spoon-shaped nose. It was designed not to cut through the water, but to glide gently over it, skimming the surface like a fallen leaf carried by a slow current. Underneath the hull, Andrew placed a solid, protective block of wood to shield the propeller from the tangled weeds and hidden debris of the bayou. But a boat is more than just its design. It is the sum of the hands that shape it. In the dusty, sunlit corners of Andrew's shop, you would find men who treated their work like a quiet devotion. There was no rushing, no frantic assembly lines. There was only the steady, rhythmic sound of a hand playing shaving ribbons of wood, the soft scuff of sandpaper smoothing a curved gunnel, and the occasional, murmured conversation between friends. They shared thermoses of dark, chicory coffee, the steam rising in the cool morning air. They shared stories of their families, their private fears about the changing world, and their quiet hopes for their children. Imagine an older carpenter, his hands dusted with sawdust, gently guiding the hands of a young apprentice. He wouldn't shout or demand. He would simply place his withered fingers over the boy's, teaching him how to read the grain, how to feel the subtle resistance of the wood, how to know, instinctively, when the curve was just right. It was in these small, unseen moments of kindness and shared knowledge that the true strength of the boats was forged. They were building vessels held together not just by nails and glue, but by a shared, quiet pride. When a local trapper, let us call him Elias, came to pick up his new boat, was a moment of profound, unspoken emotion. Elias was a man of few words, a man who had spent his entire life fighting the stubborn mud of the marsh. Andrew would walk him down to the water's edge where the wooden boat bobbed gently, its fresh paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. Elias would reach out, his trembling fingers tracing the smooth edge of the hull. He would step inside, feeling the solid, comforting weight of the wood beneath his boots. Andrew would watch as Elias took the boat out for the first time. He would watch the spoonbill bow lift gracefully over a hidden log, skipping across the shallow water without a single shudder. When Elias turned back, catching Andrew's eye from across the water, the trapper wouldn't need to shout his thanks. The deep, lasting relief softening the lines around his eyes was enough. In that quiet glance, Andrew felt a warmth spread through his chest, the pure, simple joy of having kept a neighbor safe, of having crafted something true and good. There is a beautiful, quiet dedication in taking the time to shape something meaningful from raw materials. It takes patience, a gentle touch, and a deep, abiding love for the craft. In many ways, gathering these forgotten stories of the past, these whispers of everyday heroism, feels very much the same. It takes countless hours of quiet research, sifting through the dust of history to carve out the human moments that truly matter. If you find comfort and peace in these stories, I would be so incredibly grateful if you might consider leaving a small tip, even as little as $1, on our Ko-Fi page, to support the massive time it takes to keep these stories of dedication alive. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It truly means the world to have your support as we continue to build this quiet sanctuary of history together. As the afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and bruised orange, the boatyard would slowly wind down. The rhythmic tapping of hammers would fade, replaced by the soft brushing of brooms sweeping the day's sawdust into neat, fragrant piles. The men would wash their hands, the cool water a blessed relief against their tired skin, and they would quietly pack their tools, wrapping them in soft cloth with the care of a mother tucking in a child. Andrew would often linger long after the men had gone home to their families. He enjoyed the absolute stillness of the yard at dusk. The heat of the day would rise from the ground, carrying with it the sweet smell of the nearby river and the lingering scent of curing epoxy. He would walk among the half-finished holes, looking like the ribs of great, sleeping creatures waiting to be given life. He would rest his hand on the side of a newly completed boat. The wood, which had once stood as a silent sentinel in a distant forest, was now ready for a new purpose. It would carry weary men safely through the dark, twisting waters. It would bear the weight of their fears and their silent prayers. It would be a wooden sanctuary in an unpredictable world. In these peaceful, twilight moments, Andrew did not know that his strange, shallow boats would soon be called upon to carry a much heavier burden. He did not know that the quiet whisper of the wood in his humble New Orleans shop would one day echo across the vast, terrifying expanses of the Pacific, or upon the gray, cold shores of Normandy. He did not know that millions of frightened young men, boys who had never seen a swamp or held a carpenter's plane, would one day press their trembling hands against this very same wood, praying for it to keep them safe. For now, the future was still a distant, unwritten dream. There was only the gentle lapping of the water against the docks, the first bright stars appearing in the southern sky, and the deep, restful quiet of a man who had done an honest day's work. The bayou breathed in the cool night air, and the boats rested peacefully on the dark water, safe, strong, and ready for whatever the dawn might bring. Even the stillest water feels the trembling of a distant storm, long before the first drop of rain ever touches the surface. In the heart of the Louisiana bayou, the days usually bled into one another, wrapped in a familiar, humid embrace. It was a place where the seasons were measured not by the turning of calendar pages, but by the subtle shifts in the wind, the blooming of the water lilies, and the quiet migration of the birds above. But there was a new season approaching now, one not born of nature, but of men. It was a season carried on the crackling static of the wireless radio, drifting through the open windows of the boatyard and settling like a fine, invisible dust over the newly cut timber. If you were to walk through Andrew's boatyard in those fading afternoons, you would notice a subtle change in the air. The rhythmic, comforting symphony of the saws and the hammers was still there, but in the spaces between the strikes, there was a new, heavy silence. The men who worked the wood, the fathers, the brothers, the quiet young men with sawdust in their hair and calluses on their palms, would sometimes pause in their labor. They would rest their hand planes on the workbenches, wipe the sweat from their brows with the backs of their wrists, and simply listen. From the small, battered radios perched on dusty shelves, voices from far away spoke of gathering shadows. They spoke of lands across the great oceans, of ancient cities in Europe holding their breath, and of dark clouds building in the east. The language of the broadcasts was sharp and metallic, a jarring contrast to the soft, drawling murmurs of the men in the yard. There was a young carpenter there, a boy barely out of his teenage years, whose hands were just learning the deep, intuitive secrets of the mahogany grain. He had a sweetheart waiting for him in the city, and a small, folded photograph of her tucked safely inside his shirt pocket, right over his heart. When the news from the radio grew particularly dark, speaking of distant borders and marching boots, he would unconsciously reach up and press his fingers against the fabric, feeling the shape of that photograph. It was a small, private gesture of fear and of hope. He was building boats for the shallow, muddy rivers of his home, but his mind was beginning to drift toward the deep, unknown waters of a world that seemed to be fracturing. Beside him worked older men, men whose hair was turning the color of the river fog, men who carried the silent, heavy memories of another war, a war they had been told would be the last. You could see it in their eyes, a quiet sorrow that needed no words. When they looked at the young boys planing the wood beside them, they did not speak of battlefields or strategies. Instead, they showed their care in small, everyday ways. They would pass a tin cup of cool water. They would gently correct the angle of a chisel, guiding the younger hands with a steady, reassuring touch. They poured all of their unspoken protective instincts into the wood, hoping that if they built these boats strong enough, true enough, it might somehow keep the darkness away from their shores. Andrew felt it, too. The restless energy that had always driven him began to change shape. He still spent his days walking among the hulls, breathing in the scent of the cypress and the pine, but his gaze was often drawn past the muddy banks of the river, toward the horizon. He was a man who understood the language of nature, and he knew what it meant when the birds grew suddenly quiet and the air grew thick and heavy. He knew a storm was coming. In the quiet, solitary hours of the night, long after the workers had gone home to their families, Andrew would sit alone in his small office. The glow of the desk lamp cast long, soft shadows across the walls. The blueprints of his Eureka boat, the humble vessel designed to glide over submerged logs and marshy shores, lay spread out before him. He would trace the lines of the shallow draft with his thick, withered finger. He thought about the trappers and the oilmen who used these boats, men who sought only to navigate the challenges of their daily lives. But as the days passed and the news from the east grew more urgent, the faces of the trappers in his mind began to blur, replaced by the faces of young boys in uniform. Boys like the ones working in his own yard. He began to look at the wood differently. He wondered about beaches far away from Louisiana, shores not made of soft mud and reeds, but of harsh sand and jagged coral. He wondered how a boat made for the peaceful bayou might fare in the churning, violent surf of a hostile coast. He began to realize, with a heavy, sinking feeling in his chest, that the world was going to need his boats for a terrible, monumental task. There is a profound, aching beauty in these quiet moments of realization, when ordinary people begin to understand the immense weight of the history they are living through. It is easy to look back at the past and see only the grand events, but the true story of resilience is found in the quiet, worried conversations around a kitchen table, in the gentle touch of a father's hand, and in the late-night vigil of a man staring at a blueprint, trying to find a way to keep people safe. If you find yourself moved by these deeply human stories, by the everyday heroism that so often goes unnoticed in the grand sweep of history, I would love to invite you to join our Patreon community. We have created a warm, welcoming space there for history lovers who want to look beyond the surface. By joining, you gain access to free, deeply immersive podcasts, raw and unblurred video sections that offer an unvarnished look at the past, and a quiet place to connect with others who share your passion. There is also a tip jar for those who wish to support the countless hours of research it takes to bring these stories to light. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is a wonderful community, and we would be honored to share these forgotten echoes of the past with you. As the summer slowly turned, the tension in the air became an unspoken companion to everyone in the boatyard. It wove itself into the very fabric of their daily lives. The postman's arrival, once a moment of simple, mundane routine, became a source of quiet anxiety. Letters from cousins and brothers stationed overseas arrived with foreign postmarks, their contents read in hushed tones over supper. The ink on the pages spoke of strange lands, of long watches in the night, and of a feeling that the world was holding its breath. Mothers in the neighborhood, sweeping their front porches in the cool of the evening, would stop and look down the street, their eyes lingering on the young men walking home from the yard. They would offer a warm smile, a freshly baked piece of bread, a gentle word of encouragement. It was a communal gathering of strength, a quiet bracing for an impact they could all feel but could not yet see. They were weaving a safety net of kindness, hoping it would be enough to catch the ones they loved. Down at the water's edge, the latest Eureka boat rested gently against the dock. The water lapped softly against its solid, wooden hull. Andrew walked down to the edge of the river, the wooden planks of the dock creaking slightly beneath his weight. He placed his hand on the bow of the boat. The wood was cool from the evening air, smooth and incredibly strong. He closed his eyes and listened. The radio in the distant office had been turned off for the night. There was only the sound of the frogs, the gentle rustle of the wind through the Spanish moss, and the steady, ancient flow of the river. But in his mind, Andrew was hearing something else. He was hearing the roar of an ocean he had yet to cross. He was hearing the voices of thousands of boys, strangers to him, who might one day depend on the strength of the wood beneath his hand to bring them through the fire. He patted the side of the boat, a gesture of quiet affection and a solemn promise. The design was good. It was honest. It was built to float over the dangers that lurked just beneath the surface. But he knew it would need to be better. It would need to be tougher. It would need to carry the weight not just of men, but of an entire nation's hope. The darkness of the evening finally settled over the Louisiana swamp, cloaking the great cypress trees in shadow. The stars emerged, pale and distant in the humid sky, looking down on a small boatyard where ordinary men were preparing to do extraordinary things. They did not wear uniforms, and they did not march to the sound of a drum. They wore overalls and carried hammers, and their heroism was measured in the careful swing of a mallet and the precise cut of a saw. They were simply people, living in the quiet twilight of an era, feeling the clouds gathering in the east, and deciding, one wooden plank at a time, that they would build a shelter for the storm that was to come. The world was about to change forever, and in the quiet, peaceful heart of the bayou, the stubborn lumberman and his resilient crew simply lowered their heads, steadied their hands, and prepared to meet the rising tide. There is a particular kind of cold that does not come from the winter air, but from the polished marble halls of men who have already made up their minds. Far away from the warm, breathing swamps of Louisiana, where the trees leaned close to whisper their secrets to the water, lay a very different world. It was a world of sharp angles, heavy stone, and silent, echoing corridors. This was Washington. To a man like Andrew, whose heart beat in time with the gentle rhythm of a hand playing shaving soft ribbons of cypress, the great capital city felt like an alien landscape. The air here did not smell of salt and sweet rain, it smelled of ink, polished leather, and the heavy, metallic dust of industry. Andrew had traveled north on a clattering train, carrying a battered leather briefcase filled not with money, but with something far more precious to him. Inside were his drawings. Soft pencil lines on crinkled paper, detailing the gentle, spoon-shaped bow of his shallow-water boats. He had packed his best suit, a wool thing that felt too tight across his broad, working-man's shoulders, and he had practiced the words he would say. He believed, with the innocent, trusting heart of a craftsman, that truth needed only to be shown to be understood. He believed that if he just laid the blueprints on their grand mahogany tables, the men in uniforms would see the elegant, simple solution to their most terrifying problems. But the rooms of power are rarely moved by quiet elegance. Imagine him sitting in those vast, silent waiting rooms. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced admirals who looked down from their gilded frames with eyes of painted ice. The only sound was the solemn, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner, marking the slow passing of hours. Andrew would sit on a velvet chair that felt far too delicate for him, his large, calloused hands resting awkwardly on his knees. He watched as men in pristine white uniforms moved briskly past him, their medals clinking faintly, their shoes squeaking on the immaculate marble floors. They spoke in hushed, clipped tones, a language of protocol and rank that Andrew did not know. When he was finally ushered into the grand offices, the reception was polite, but devastatingly cold. He would unroll his blueprints, his thick fingers tracing the lines he knew by heart. He spoke of the mud, the sandbars, the way the water pushed back against a heavy hull. He spoke of how a flat bottom could slide gracefully over an obstacle that would tear the belly out of a traditional ship. He spoke from his soul, his booming voice softened into a gentle plea. The men across the desk would listen. They would adjust their spectacles, nod politely, and then, with a few quiet words, they would dismiss everything he was. They looked at his designs and saw only a swamp boat. They believed that real vessels, Navy vessels, had to be born of cold steel and deep water. They could not fathom that a lumberman from the muddy reaches of the deep South could teach them anything about navigating the oceans. They thanked him for his time, rolled up his dreams with dismissive hands, and showed him to the door. That rejection was not a sudden, sharp pain. It was a slow, crushing weight. It was the deafening silence of a letter returning unopened, or the polite, sterile words of a typed dismissal arriving in the afternoon post. Week after week, month after month, Andrew faced this impenetrable wall of tradition. There is a profound, private ache in knowing you carry a piece of salvation in your hands, only to find that no one will let you give it to them. In the lonely evenings, returning to a small, unremarkable hotel room in a city that did not care for him, Andrew would take off his heavy suit jacket and sit on the edge of the bed. The sounds of the city outside the window were harsh and unforgiving. He would reach into his pocket and pull out a small, smooth offcut of mahogany he had brought from his shop. He would turn it over and over in his palm, feeling the familiar, comforting grain. It grounded him. It reminded him of the smell of the bayou, of the quiet, honest faces of the men who worked beside him, of the truth he knew lived in the wood. He wrote letters home in those quiet, dimly lit hours. He used hotel stationery, the pen scratching softly across the paper. He wrote to his wife, trying to keep the heavy exhaustion out of his words. He wrote of the weather, of the people he had seen, shielding her from the deep, lonely ache of his daily defeats. He would write, "They just don't see it yet, my love. But they will. The wood doesn't lie." It was a quiet, everyday heroism, the gentle art of sheltering those you love from your own despair, of finding the strength to wake up the next morning, put the uncomfortable suit back on, and walk back into the cold marble halls to try again. There is a deep comfort in remembering these quiet, human struggles, and in holding on to the tangible pieces of the past that connect us to such profound resilience. When we surround ourselves with things that honor history, we keep the memories of these unseen battles alive. If you find yourself wanting to connect more deeply with this era, I love to recommend beautiful WWII memorabilia, or taking a quiet evening to watch a beautifully crafted film like Midway on Prime, which captures the vastness of the history these men were preparing for. I have placed a link for you to explore these items. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is a small, meaningful way to bring the honor of the past into our homes today. The years dragged on. 5 long years of closed doors and polite smiles that did not reach the eyes. 5 years of watching the storm clouds gather over the oceans, knowing that the time was running out, knowing that the boys who would soon be sent to distant, hostile shores were going to need a miracle they did not yet possess. The brass in Washington thought they were dealing with a simple tradesman who would eventually grow tired and go home. They did not understand the nature of the man they were dismissing. Andrew was a man of the woods, and he had learned his lessons from the trees. He knew that the strongest oak does not grow in the sunniest, calmest meadow. It grows on the edge of the cliff, where the wind howls and the storms beat against it. It learns to root deeply. It learns to bend so that it will not break. And so, he bent. He absorbed their silence, their disdain, their rigid superiority. He absorbed it all, and he quietly rooted himself deeper into his conviction. While the Navy bureaus wasted precious time sketching heavy, cumbersome steel beasts that would ultimately sink in the shallow surfs of testing grounds, Andrew simply went back to his yard in the warm, humid embrace of New Orleans. He didn't shout. He didn't curse the men in the white uniforms. He simply took off his suit, rolled up his sleeves, and went back to the wood. He knew that the world was about to change in a terrible, frightening way. He knew that eventually, all the polished marble and polite theories in Washington would be rendered meaningless by the harsh, unforgiving realities of the sand and the tide. And when that day came, when the silence of the brass was finally shattered by the desperate cries for a solution, he would be ready. The boats would be ready. Waiting in the shadows of the bayou, listening to the gentle lap of the water, holding on to the quiet promise of a stubborn man who refused to let the cold world extinguish his light. Some storms do not break with a sudden, violent clap of thunder. They settle slowly into the bones, a quiet, lingering dampness that tests the very strength of the spirit. In the small, dimly lit office attached to the New Orleans boatyard, the air hung heavy and still, thick with the scent of sawdust, old river water, and the sharp, metallic tang of ink. The seasons had turned many times since Andrew first traveled to Washington. The humid, breathless summers had bled into the soft, gray winters of the bayou, and still, the world outside remained caught in a strange, agonizing twilight, waiting for a war everyone knew was coming, yet moving with a sluggish, bureaucratic indifference. On Andrew's desk, bathed in the warm, golden circle of a single desk lamp, sat a small, neat stack of envelopes. They were crisp, heavy, and stark white, bearing the official crests of the United States Navy. To anyone else, they might have looked like important, distinguished correspondence. But to Andrew, they were heavy stones pressing down upon his chest. They were letters of denial. Beautifully typed, perfectly polite, and completely devastating. Each letter was a closed door. Each one stated, in the sterile, detached language of men who had never felt the violent shudder of a boat running aground, that his designs were unneeded. That a flat-bottomed, wooden swamp boat had no place in the grand, steel-clad visions of modern warfare. They told him to go back to his lumber, to his trappers, to his quiet little life in the South. You could see the toll these letters took on him, not in loud outbursts, but in the slow, settling weariness of his broad shoulders. He was a man who had spent his life moving forward, fighting the unpredictable currents of the Mississippi and the tangled roots of the deep marsh. But fighting the current of human stubbornness, of institutional pride, was a different kind of exhaustion. It was a silent, invisible tide that threatened to pull him under. When the yard finally fell silent at the end of the day, when the great saw spun down to a halt and the workers packed away their tools, Andrew would often remain in his office. He would lean back in his creaking wooden chair, close his tired eyes, and simply listen to the rain drumming softly against the tin roof. In those solitary hours, the private fears he kept hidden from the world would quietly step out of the shadows. He was not a wealthy man. He was a working man who had poured every ounce of his livelihood, every spare dollar, and every waking thought into these shallow draft boats. He was keeping his men employed, keeping the timber arriving, paying for the epoxy and the brass fittings, all on the fragile hope that someone, someday, would listen. He worried about the families of the men who worked for him. He pictured their small kitchens, the children doing homework by the stove, the wives stretching the weekly groceries. He carried the weight of their survival on his back, and the stack of white envelopes on his desk whispered that he was leading them all toward ruin. One particular evening, the rain was falling in a gentle, steady rhythm, washing the dust from the yard and turning the river into a canvas of 1,000 tiny ripples. Andrew finally turned off the desk lamp, the room plunging into the comforting, gray gloom of dusk. He pulled his heavy coat over his shoulders and walked out into the yard. The men had long since gone home, but the echoes of their labor still seemed to hum in the damp air. As he walked past the workbench of an older carpenter, a man with deep lines etched around his eyes and a quiet, knowing smile, Andrew noticed something resting on the edge of the table. It was a small, perfectly smoothed offcut of mahogany. It had been sanded so meticulously that it felt like silk to the touch, and its rich, dark grain glowed even in the low light. It was not a tool, and it was not a part of a boat. It was simply a piece of wood, made beautiful by a pair of rough hands, left out as a silent offering. Andrew picked it up, feeling the warmth of the wood against his palm. He knew what it meant. The men in the yard did not read the letters from Washington. They did not understand the politics of admirals and procurement boards. But they watched Andrew. They saw the heavy drag of his boots and the tired set of his jaw. And in their own quiet way, they were telling him that they believed in him. They were telling him that they knew the wood was good, that the boats were true, and that they would keep shaping the timber as long as he asked them to. It was a small, profound moment of everyday heroism, a quiet tether of loyalty thrown to a drowning man. He slipped the mahogany into his pocket, holding onto it like a talisman, and walked home through the misty streets. When he arrived at his house, the windows were glowing with a soft, inviting light. His wife was waiting for him. She was a woman of immense, quiet strength, the steady anchor to his restless ocean. She didn't ask him if a letter had arrived. She could read the answer in the way he hung his hat by the door. She simply poured him a cup of hot, dark coffee, placed her hand gently over his on the kitchen table, and sat with him in the silence. There is a deep, abiding grace in someone who does not try to fix your pain with empty words, but simply chooses to sit with you in the dark. She knew he was risking everything, and she loved him not despite his stubbornness, but because of it. It is difficult, looking back through the soft, hazy lens of history, to truly grasp the raw, terrifying uncertainty of those days. We know how the story ends. We know the boats will eventually sail. But Andrew did not. He was living in the harsh, unfiltered reality of the moment. So much of the history we consume today is polished and neatly packaged, stripped of the grit, the fear, and the unvarnished truth of what it meant to endure. If you are someone who deeply values the unpolished truth, I want to gently recommend our Gumroad store. There, we offer a carefully curated digital collection of unseen, raw images and videos from the war, materials that capture the harsh, uncensored realities of the era, which are simply too restricted to show on this platform. It is a profound way to truly see the world these men were preparing to face. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. That night, lying awake beneath the heavy cotton quilts, listening to the wind breathing through the cracks in the window pane, Andrew made a quiet, irrevocable decision. He would not stop. The brass in Washington might control the budgets and the contracts, but they did not control the water, and they did not control the truth. If the Navy wanted a boat that could land on a beach, a boat that would not leave young men stranded in the deep, murderous surf, they were going to need his design. They simply didn't know it yet. He decided he would not wait for their permission to save those boys. He would build the boats. He would build them stronger, better, and faster, using his own money, risking his own name, until the day came when the world had no choice but to recognize what he had created. The next morning, the fog over the bayou was thick and luminous, glowing like spun sugar in the early light. When Andrew walked back into the yard, his step was a little lighter. The weariness was still there, woven into the fabric of his clothes, but his eyes held a new, calm resolve. He did not go into his office to look at the letters. He walked straight down to the water's edge, where the latest Eureka boat bobbed gently against the dock. He climbed aboard, feeling the familiar, comforting sway of the deck beneath his boots. He started the engine, the low, steady rumble vibrating up through his legs, a mechanical heartbeat in the quiet morning. He untied the heavy hemp ropes and steered the boat out into the river. He didn't just take it for a gentle cruise, he drove it hard against the current. He found a massive, submerged log that had washed down from upriver, a treacherous obstacle that would have torn the hull out of a standard skiff. He aimed the blunt, spoon-shaped bow directly at it, gripping the wooden wheel with his large hands, his jaw set in quiet defiance. As the boat struck the log, it did not shatter. It did not sink. With a beautiful, muscular grace, the wooden hull simply slid up, skipped over the rotting bark, and slammed back down into the water on the other side, sending a spray of cool river water washing over the windshield. Andrew let out a slow, deeply satisfying breath. The boat was a marvel. It was a perfect harmony of human ingenuity and natural law. It did exactly what it was meant to do. He stopped the engine and let the boat drift, the silence rushing back in to fill the space. He sat there in the middle of the river, surrounded by the whispering reeds and the ancient cypress trees. The sky above was vast and gray, heavy with the promise of more rain. He thought of the young men in uniform, boys from farms in Iowa and streets in Brooklyn, boys who were currently marching on parade grounds, unaware of the terrifying beaches that awaited them. He thought of his own men back in the yard, shaping the wood with careful, loving hands. He realized then that he was no longer just a lumberman building boats for trappers. He was a man building an ark before the rain had even started to fall. He was carrying the quiet, agonizing burden of foresight. The rejection letters sitting on his desk were meaningless now, just paper and ink. He knew, with a deep, unbreakable certainty, that the day was coming when the pristine white uniforms would arrive at his muddy, sawdust-covered door, asking for a miracle. And when they did, he would not turn them away. He would simply point to the water, where his wooden dreams were already floating, strong and steady, waiting to carry the boys back home. Until then, he would keep working. He would keep holding the line against the current, finding his peace in the quiet rhythm of the saw, the comforting smell of the wood, and the unwavering belief that a good piece of timber, crafted with love, can weather any storm the world cares to send its way. The sea has a way of keeping secrets, quietly burying heavy mistakes beneath the soft, silent sand. Far away from the warm, sheltering embrace of the Louisiana bayous, the Atlantic coast stretched out in a long, unbroken line of gray. Here, in the early months of a world slowly waking up to war, the ocean was not a gentle companion. It was a cold, breathing giant. The winds that swept off the water were biting and sharp, carrying the bitter scent of salt and crushed shells. On these desolate, windswept beaches, hidden away from the eyes of the public, the Navy was trying to build its own bridge to the shore. They were proud men, the architects of the fleet. They believed in the strength of iron, the weight of steel, and the undeniable power of a heavy hull. And so, they designed landing craft that reflected their beliefs. These were imposing, rigid machines, built to conquer the water through sheer force. But the sea, with its shifting tides and hidden sandbars, does not yield to force. It only yields to understanding. Imagine a young sailor standing on that freezing beach in the pale, blue light of dawn. Let us call him Thomas. He was a boy from the golden, rolling hills of the Midwest, a boy who had only ever known the quiet rustle of wheat fields and the still, mirrored surface of small farm ponds. The ocean was a vast, terrifying mystery to him. He wore a heavy wool coat that smelled faintly of dampness and fear, his collar pulled up tight against the stinging wind. Thomas was one of the many young men tasked with testing these new, heavy iron boats. They would climb aboard in the deep water, their boots ringing out against the metal deck with a hollow, lonely sound. The engines would roar to life, a mechanical scream that vibrated in their teeth, and the boat would surge forward toward the shore. Inside the hull, it was dark and suffocating. The boys would hold onto the cold steel rails, their knuckles turning white, their breaths visible in the freezing air. They could not see the horizon. They could only feel the violent, sickening lurch as the heavy boat hit the surf zone. And then, the inevitable would happen. The heavy, unyielding bow would strike a hidden sandbar or a submerged reef. Instead of gliding over it, the boat would plow directly into the obstacle, a shuddering, violent crash that sent the boys tumbling against the steel bulkheads. The heavy iron, meant to protect them, would suddenly become an anchor. The boat would list painfully to one side, wedged deep in the unforgiving sand, trapped in the crushing embrace of the breaking waves. Water would pour over the sides, freezing, gray, and terrifying. The boys would scramble to free themselves, wading through the chest-high surf, their muscles cramping from the cold, fighting their way to the lonely beach. When it was over, they would sit huddled around small, sputtering driftwood fires on the sand. They wrapped their trembling hands around tin cups of bitter coffee, watching the steam vanish into the wind. They didn't speak of the fear. They didn't have to. The quiet realization hung heavy in the misty air, shared in the brief, knowing glances between shivering friends. They looked out at the ocean, where the dark, jagged silhouette of their sunken boat rested in the shallows like a discarded toy. They all knew the truth. If they were asked to ride those heavy steel coffins onto a hostile beach, with real danger waiting for them in the dunes, they would never make it out of the water. The boats were a failure. It was a quiet, desperate failure, buried beneath the roar of the surf, but it was breaking the hearts of the boys who had to endure it. In the lonely hours of the night, sitting in the dimly lit barracks, Thomas would write letters home to his mother. His handwriting, usually looping and confident, was small and cramped. He wouldn't write about the sinking boats or the freezing water. He loved her too much to give her that burden. He wrote about the food, the friends he had made, and the strange, salty smell of the ocean air. But mothers have a way of hearing the things left unsaid. Hundreds of miles away, sitting by the soft, yellow light of a kitchen lamp, a mother would hold that thin piece of paper and feel the cold tremor in her son's words. She would smooth the creases with a gentle thumb, close her eyes, and whisper a quiet, desperate prayer into the stillness of the house. A prayer for wood to hold, for water to calm, for her boy to find a safe way through the storm. History is often shaped by these quiet, hidden moments, far away from the grand speeches and the parades. So many vital operations, silent struggles, and desperate prayers were kept in the shadows, hidden from the public eye to protect the fragile morale of a nation holding its breath. If you find comfort in uncovering these lost echoes of the past, and honoring the everyday heroism that happened behind closed doors, I would love to invite you to join our email newsletter. As a heartfelt thank you, we offer a free ebook, The Shadow War, 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II, along with weekly, gentle deep dives into the forgotten facts of history. It is a warm, welcoming community of people who care about remembering. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. While the heavy iron boat sank into the cold Atlantic sand, a very different scene was unfolding in the deep, humid South. In New Orleans, the air was warm and fragrant with the scent of blooming jasmine and wet earth. Andrew's boatyard hummed with a gentle, steady rhythm. Andrew did not know the names of the boys shivering on the northern beaches, but he could feel the echo of their struggle. It was a strange, invisible tether that connected the stubborn lumbermen to the frightened sailors. He spent his days watching the mahogany shavings fall from the workbenches, piling up like soft, golden snow. He watched his workers, their hands moving with quiet, intuitive grace, shaping the wood to match the curve of the water. He would take his own boats out onto the bayou, watching the spoon-shaped bows dance over the sunken logs and the tangled roots. The wood was so light, so willing to work with the water rather than against it. It didn't try to conquer the swamp, it simply asked for safe passage. And the swamp granted it. He knew the time was drawing near. He could sense it in the changing wind. Back in the polished, marble halls of Washington, the silence was beginning to crack. The admirals and the procurement officers, the men who had dismissed the lumberman and his swamp boats, were staring at the reports from the testing grounds. The papers were neatly typed, but the truth they contained was messy and undeniable. The steel landing crafts were too heavy. They were getting stuck. They were putting lives in profound, unnecessary danger. The weight of responsibility is a terrible, quiet burden. Imagine a junior officer, his uniform immaculate, sitting alone in his office long after the sun had set over the Capitol. The only light came from the small lamp on his desk, illuminating the bleak reports of sunken boats and exhausted sailors. He thought of the young men out there in the cold. He thought of the mothers waiting for letters. And then, perhaps guided by a moment of quiet bravery, he opened a bottom drawer. From beneath a stack of forgotten files, he pulled out a weathered, slightly crumpled set of blueprints. They were the drawings Andrew had left behind all those years ago. The drawings of a shallow draft boat built for the mud and the reeds. The officer smoothed the blueprints out over the desk, running his hand over the elegant, unusual curve of the bow. In the dim light of the office, surrounded by the failures of heavy industry, the simple wisdom of the wooden boat suddenly seemed to glow with a quiet, saving grace. It was not a weapon. It was a lifeline. He didn't make a grand speech. He didn't shout. He simply picked up his pen, attached the lumberman's blueprints to the top of the failure reports, and quietly placed the file back into the stream of command. It was a tiny, silent act of rebellion against pride, a gentle turning of the tide that would eventually change the course of the entire world. The long years of rejection were finally coming to an end. The deafening silence of the brass was giving way to the soft, urgent whisper of necessity. The Navy was realizing that they could not fight the ocean, and they desperately needed a man who knew how to dance with it. They needed the man in the bayou. Down in Louisiana, the night was peaceful. Andrew walked through the empty boatyard, the moon casting long, silver shadows across the stacked timber. He ran his hand along the smooth side of a newly finished Eureka boat. He could feel the latent energy in the wood, a quiet readiness waiting to be called upon. He didn't know that the tide in Washington had turned. He only knew that he had done the work, he had kept the faith, and his boats were ready. The world was holding its breath. The young sailors on the cold beaches dreamed of dry land and warm sun. The mothers prayed in the quiet glow of their kitchens. And the boats waited in the gentle embrace of the southern waters, strong, silent, and wonderfully light, listening for the call that would finally ask them to carry the heavy hopes of a generation. There is a moment just before the sun breaks through the morning mist, when the whole world seems to hold its breath in quiet anticipation. On this particular morning, the waters of the Louisiana lake lay perfectly still, resembling a vast, uninterrupted sheet of hammered silver. The air was heavy and sweet, carrying the familiar, comforting fragrance of damp earth, crushed pine needles, and the faint, distant perfume of night-blooming jasmine. The mist clung softly to the twisted roots of the cypress trees, wrapping the shoreline in a gentle, gray velvet embrace. It was a morning that felt incredibly private, a quiet corner of the world waking up slowly, stretching its limbs before the heat of the southern sun could arrive. Yet, upon the muddy banks of this peaceful water, an unusual gathering had formed. Standing uncomfortably on the soft, yielding ground were men who belonged to a world of sharp angles and polished stone. They were naval officers sent down from the cold, echoing halls of Washington. They wore immaculate uniforms, their brass buttons catching the pale, early light, their shoes already scuffed by the unforgiving mud of the bayou. They stood with their arms crossed over their chests, a silent barricade of skepticism. They looked out at the water with tired, doubtful eyes. For 5 long years, they had read the typed reports and dismissed the blueprints. Now, they had finally come to see the lumberman's foolish dream for themselves. A few yards away from this line of pristine, uncomfortable men stood Andrew. He did not wear a uniform. He wore the simple, sturdy clothes of a working man, the fabric softened by years of sun and sawdust. If he felt the crushing weight of their judgmental stares, he did not show it. His broad shoulders were relaxed, his hands resting quietly at his sides. He was looking out at the water, but his mind was traveling far beyond the mist. He was thinking of the letters of rejection that had piled up on his desk, the polite, devastating words that had told him his life's work was useless. He was thinking of the weary faces of the carpenters in his shop, men who had poured their silent, loving craftsmanship into every wooden joint, trusting him to lead them through the lean years. But most of all, he was thinking of the young boys in uniform he had seen on the streets of New Orleans. Boys with smooth cheeks and frightened eyes, boys who were soon going to be sent across dark oceans to face unimaginable things. He knew, with a deep, aching certainty in his chest, that those boys needed a miracle. And he believed, with every fiber of his being, that the miracle was waiting right here, bobbing gently in the shallow water. The boat was called the Eureka. It rested against the wooden dock like a faithful, resting hound. It was not a beautiful vessel by the standards of the men from Washington. It possessed no sleek, menacing lines, no armor plating, no towering guns. It was made of wood, warm, living wood. Its bow was blunt and curved upward, shaped like the underside of a spoon. It smelled of fresh paint, marine epoxy, and the deep, rich scent of mahogany. Andrew walked slowly down the wooden planks of the dock. The wood groaned softly beneath his heavy boots, a familiar, comforting sound. He stepped aboard the Eureka, feeling the boat settle and steady itself beneath his weight. He ran his calloused hand along the wooden steering wheel. The wood was cool and smooth, polished by the countless hours of careful sanding by an old carpenter in his shop, a man who had left a small piece of his own heart in the grain. Andrew turned the key. The engine did not roar with the violent, mechanical fury of a war machine. Instead, it awoke with a low, steady, comforting rumble. It was a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the wooden hull, through the soles of Andrew's boots, and settled into a steady rhythm in his chest. It sounded like a heartbeat. On the bank, the officers shifted their weight, pulling their heavy woolen coats a little tighter against the morning chill. They prepared themselves for disappointment. They were accustomed to heavy iron beasts that fought the water, machines that inevitably lost their battles against the hidden sandbars and submerged reefs of the world. They fully expected this wooden toy to meet a similar, embarrassing fate. Andrew steered the Eureka away from the dock, the hull slipping through the silver water with barely a whisper. He moved out toward the center of the lake, the mist parting gently before him like a curtain. The boat did not slice deeply into the water. It rested lightly upon the surface, skimming the top of the lake with an effortless, breathtaking grace. As the boat gathered speed, the officers on the shore stopped shifting. They grew very still. They watched as the blunt, unusual bow began to lift slightly, riding the water rather than pushing through it. Andrew's eyes scanned the surface ahead. He knew this water better than he knew the lines on his own palms. He knew where the shadows hid the dangers. He guided the boat toward a section of the lake notorious for its submerged debris, a graveyard of ancient, waterlogged trees that had washed down during the heavy spring floods. He spotted his target. It was a massive, half-sunken cypress log, its bark stripped away by time, sitting just inches below the surface. To a traditional naval vessel, this log was a death sentence. It was the kind of hidden trap that would catch a deep keel, tear open a metal hull, and leave a crew stranded and terrified. On the bank, one of the older officers, a man who had seen too many boats lost to unseen hazards, saw the dark shadow in the water directly in the Eureka's path. He instinctively took a step forward, his breath catching in his throat. He waited for the sickening, violent crunch of splintering wood. He waited for the boat to lurch, to stop dead in the water, to fail. Andrew did not slow down. He did not turn the wheel. He kept his eyes fixed softly on the horizon, his hand steady, trusting completely in the wood, the design, and the quiet devotion of the men who had built it. The Eureka hit the log. But there was no violent crash. There was no terrible shudder. Instead, there was a sound like a long, deep sigh. The spoon-shaped bow met the solid wood of the hidden log and simply slid upward. The boat lifted out of the water, its flat bottom scraping gently against the ancient cypress with a soft, forgiving shhh sound. For one miraculous, suspended second, the boat seemed to take flight. It hovered above the danger, skipping over the massive obstacle like a stone cast by a careful hand, and then settled softly back into the silver water on the other side. It was a beautiful, defiant leap. It was the spoonbill's flight. On the shoreline, the silence was absolute. The officers were frozen, their eyes wide, their mouths slightly parted in quiet disbelief. They had just witnessed the impossible. They had seen water and would conspire to defeat gravity and danger. They had seen a vessel that did not conquer nature, but danced with it. Andrew guided the boat back toward the shore. He did not aim for the wooden dock. He aimed directly for the sloping, muddy bank where the officers stood. He kept the engine running, allowing the boat to carry its momentum right into the shallows. The flat bottom met the soft earth, sliding smoothly up onto the muddy shore, coming to a gentle, perfectly controlled stop just feet away from the polished shoes of the men from Washington. Andrew cut the engine. The sudden silence rushing back in was profoundly moving. He did not smile. He did not boast. He simply stepped over the side of the wooden hull, his boots sinking into the familiar mud, and looked at the men who had rejected him for 5 long years. He saw the change in their faces. The hardened skepticism had melted away, replaced by a quiet, overwhelming awe. The older officer, the one who had braced for the crash, slowly lowered his crossed arms. He took a hesitant step forward and reached out his trembling hand, placing his fingers gently against the smooth, damp wood of the Eureka's bow. In that single, quiet touch, the war changed. The officer didn't speak, but his eyes communicated everything Andrew needed to know. He saw the beaches of faraway islands. He saw the treacherous, sandy shores of a dark continent. And he saw, for the very first time, a way to bring his boys safely through the surf. The wooden boat was no longer a lumberman's folly. It was salvation. It takes a very special kind of patience and an unbreakable dedication to build something that truly matters, to hold on to a quiet truth even when the rest of the world turns away. The men in that boatyard poured their lives into shaping history with their own hands. Bringing these deeply human stories out of the shadows and into the light requires its own kind of careful, loving craftsmanship. It takes countless hours of research, sifting through the quiet echoes of the past to find the moments that touch our hearts. If you find peace and value in these gentle walks through history, and if you would like to help us continue this work, I would be so incredibly grateful if you might consider leaving a small tip, even as little as $1, on our Ko-Fi page. Your support is the foundation that allows this community to thrive and these stories to be told. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. The mist was finally beginning to lift from the lake, the morning sun breaking through the gray canopy to cast long, warm beams of golden light across the water. The silver ripples danced and sparkled, a quiet celebration of the dawn. Andrew turned around and looked back at the lake. The heavy, invisible burden he had carried in his chest for 5 years seemed to dissolve into the morning air. He thought of his wife, sitting at their kitchen table, holding her cup of coffee, waiting for him to come home. He thought of Elias, the trapper who had first taught him the secrets of the shallow water. And he thought of the boys, those countless, unknown boys sleeping in their barracks around the country. They did not know it yet, but a promise had just been made to them on the muddy shores of a Louisiana lake. A promise written in Philippine mahogany and southern pine. A promise that when the terrible day came, and they were asked to step out into the cold, terrifying unknown, they would not be left to the mercy of the deep water. They would be carried by the spoonbill's flight, cradled in the strong, protective arms of the bayou, guided safely all the way to the sand. The men in uniforms finally found their voices, speaking in hushed, reverent tones as they crowded around the wooden hull. But Andrew just closed his eyes, listening to the gentle lapping of the water against the shore, feeling the warm southern sun on his tired face, finally at peace, knowing the wood had spoken, and the world had finally listened. There is a profound, sudden shift in the heavy southern air when a city realizes it is no longer just a place on a map, but a lifeline for the world. If you had walked the cobblestone streets of New Orleans in those early days, just as the long shadows of the evening began to retreat before the dawn, you would have felt a new rhythm pulsing beneath your feet. For centuries, this was a city that moved with the slow, languid grace of the Mississippi River. It was a place of quiet, damp mornings, where the scent of chicory coffee mingled with the sweet perfume of the magnolias, and the passing of time was measured only by the gentle tolling of church bells. But the world beyond the bayou had fractured. The call had finally come from the cold, marble halls of Washington, carried down the telegraph lines and bursting into the humid air with a desperate urgency. They needed the wooden boats. They needed them all, and they needed them now. And so, the city awoke. It did not wake with the terrifying clatter of a battlefield, but with the steady, determined murmur of a people answering a call. Down by the water, the modest boatyard of Andrew Higgins was undergoing a miraculous transformation. The small, quiet sheds where a handful of men once shaped wood for trappers and fishermen were suddenly expanding, swelling outward like a great, deep breath. Huge, echoing warehouses of corrugated tin and steel were rising along the muddy banks, casting long reflections into the dark river. But a building is just an empty shell. The true heartbeat of this new world came from the streets. From the porches of old wooden houses, from the crowded neighborhoods, and from the quiet, dusty parishes beyond the city limits, the people began to walk. They poured out of their homes in the pale, violet light of the morning. There were older men, their hands already withered by decades of hard labor, pulling their flat caps down against the morning mist. There were young boys, barely old enough to shave, their eyes wide with the nervous energy of suddenly doing a man's work. And, in a quiet, beautiful revolution of necessity, there were the women. Imagine a woman named Clara. Before the shadows gathered in the east, Clara's hands had known only the delicate, familiar topography of a sewing machine and the warm, powdered dough of her kitchen table. She had a son, a quiet boy with a crooked smile, who was now wearing a uniform on a ship somewhere in the vast, terrifying expanse of the Pacific. Every morning, Clara would carefully fold her apron, tie a sturdy cotton scarf around her hair, and walk toward the looming silhouette of the boatyard. When she first stepped onto the factory floor, the sheer scale of it must have been overwhelming. The air was thick with a golden haze of sawdust, catching the sunlight that streamed through the high windows and turning it into visible beams of light. The noise was immense, a towering wall of sound, the high-pitched whine of the circular saws, the deep, rhythmic thud of the drop hammers, and the constant, urgent hiss of the steam presses. But as Clara took her place at the long wooden workbench, the noise slowly stopped being a chaotic roar. It became a symphony. It was the symphony of sawdust. She learned to hold a heavy electric sander, her small, delicate hands gripping the vibrating metal until her knuckles turned white. She learned the smell of marine epoxy and the feel of the rough Philippine mahogany. Every time she smoothed a curve of wood, every time she guided a piece of timber that would eventually become the hull of a landing craft, she was not just building a boat. She was reaching out across the ocean. She poured all of her unspoken love, her desperate, silent prayers for her boy's safety, into the grain of the wood. She believed, with the fierce, quiet conviction of a mother, that if she made this wood smooth enough, strong enough, it would somehow protect a child who belonged to someone else, and in return, someone, somewhere, was doing the same for her son. She was not alone. The factory floor was a tapestry of everyday heroism, woven together by shared worry and a stubborn, beautiful resilience. Beside Clara worked men and women of all backgrounds, people who might never have crossed paths in the quiet days of peace. In the sweltering heat of the New Orleans afternoon, the divisions of the outside world simply melted away. They shared thermoses of ice water. They shared quiet smiles over the deafening roar of the machinery. When a heavy plank of cypress slipped, 3 pairs of hands would instantly reach out to catch it, moving with a seamless, unspoken grace. There was a young man there, too. Let us call him Thomas. He had been left behind. A quiet murmur of the heart, a slight irregularity in his chest, had kept him from putting on the uniform that his 2 older brothers wore so proudly. He carried that exemption like a heavy, invisible stone in his pocket. He felt the sting of a war he could not fight, the guilt of being safe while the ones he loved were in danger. So, Thomas poured his entire soul into the boatyard. He worked the night shifts, when the factory was illuminated by the harsh, unearthly glow of the arc lamps. He worked until his muscles burned and his fingers were raw and blistered. In the quiet moments of his break, he would sit on a stack of timber near the open doors, looking out at the black ink of the Mississippi River. He would pull a crumpled, grease-stained letter from his brother out of his pocket. He had read it 100 times, tracing the familiar handwriting until the words were etched into his memory. "We are waiting," the letter said. "We are waiting for the boats." Thomas would fold the letter, place it back near his own irregular heart, and return to the line. He drove every screw, glued every joint, and sanded every edge as if his brother's life depended entirely on his hands. He was fighting his own silent battle, finding his courage not in the deafening crack of a rifle, but in the steady, relentless rhythm of the hammer. It is a profoundly beautiful thing to witness people finding a community in the darkest of times, gathering together in a shared space to lift each other up and build something stronger than fear. Today, years removed from the roar of those factories, we still seek out spaces where we can come together over a shared devotion to the past, where we can remember these quiet heroes. If you feel a connection to these unvarnished, deeply human stories, I would love to warmly welcome you to our Patreon community. It is a quiet sanctuary for history lovers, where we share free podcasts, raw, unblurred video sections that offer an unflinching look at the realities these people faced, and a tip jar to support the massive amount of time it takes to carefully weave these stories together. We would be truly honored to have you join us. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the sun would finally dip below the horizon, painting the Louisiana sky in deep, bruising shades of purple and gold, the factory did not sleep. The symphony simply changed its players. The day shift, exhausted, their clothes heavy with sweat and coated in the fine, fragrant dust of the wood, would slowly file out the wide doors. They would pass the night shift coming in, exchanging tired, knowing nods. There was a gentle, reassuring continuity to it. The work never stopped. The rhythm never faltered. Andrew would often walk the floor during these shift changes. He was a man who had spent his life fighting the stubborn currents, and now he found himself at the helm of an impossible tide. He looked at the faces of his workers. He saw the deep, dark circles under their eyes. He saw the bandages on their fingers and the ache in their backs. He knew he was asking the impossible of them, asking them to push their bodies far beyond the limits of ordinary endurance. But when he looked closer, beneath the exhaustion, he saw something else. He saw an unbreakable, quiet dignity. He saw a city that had discovered its own immense strength. He would stop and place his large, heavy hand on Clara's shoulder as she packed away her tools for the evening. He didn't need to speak. And that simple, gentle touch was an entire world of gratitude. He was thanking her for her hands, for her prayers, and for the sun she had given to the ocean. Outside, the finished Eureka boats were lined up along the water, row upon row of them, bobbing gently in the dark river. They smelled of fresh paint and possibility. They were no longer just the dreams of a stubborn lumberman. They were the collective heartbeat of thousands of mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers. Every piece of wood held a whisper, every nail held a promise. The night air was thick, wrapping around the boatyard like a heavy, warm blanket. Inside, the lights burned bright, cutting through the darkness, and the saws began to sing once more. It was a strange, industrial lullaby, a song of sawdust, sweat, and salvation, echoing out over the quiet waters of the bayou, promising the waiting world that help was finally on the way. In the deepest, quietest hours of the night, when the rest of the world has surrendered to sleep, a different kind of devotion breathes beneath the glow of the factory lamps. If you were to step out of the heavy, humid darkness of the New Orleans streets and walk through the wide, open doors of the boatyard, you would not find the chaotic, blinding roar of modern industry. Instead, you would step into a world of shadows and soft, amber light. The vast, cavernous sheds by the edge of the Mississippi River felt less like a factory and more like a midnight sanctuary. The high arc lamps suspended from the wooden rafters cast long, wavering beams across the dusty air, catching the millions of tiny wood shavings that floated there, turning them into a slow, drifting snow of gold. In this dim, hallowed light, the faces of the night shift emerged. These were not soldiers. They wore no uniforms, possessed no medals, and marched to no band. They were the unseen army of the midnight hour, dressed in faded denim overalls, patched cotton dresses, and heavy leather aprons worn smooth by time and labor. They moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, a slow, rhythmic dance choreographed by necessity and fueled by an unspoken, collective fear. The sounds of the night shift were different from the day. The frantic, high-pitched scream of the circular saws was rested. Instead, the air was filled with a soothing, hypnotic lullaby of hand tools. The steady, rhythmic shhhh of sandpaper gliding over the curve of a mahogany hull. The soft, dull thud of a wooden mallet driving a peg into place. The gentle sweep of a bristled broom gathering the sawdust from the floor. It sounded like the breathing of a great, sleeping giant. Look closely at a man standing near the stern of a half-finished boat. His name is Arthur. He is an older man, his hair the color of river fog, his shoulders stooped from a lifetime of carrying burdens that were not his own. His hands are thick and heavy, scarred by old mistakes and hardened by decades of unforgiving work. Arthur knows the smell of a battlefield. He remembers a different war, fought in the deep, freezing mud of another continent, when he was just a boy. He remembers the cold. He remembers the terrifying, suffocating silence just before the dawn. Because Arthur remembers, he works with a silent, fierce intensity. He does not use a measuring tape to find the center of the wooden beam. He runs his calloused thumb along the edge, feeling the life of the wood, trusting the deep, intuitive knowledge in his bones. As he tightens a heavy brass fixture against the hull, his jaw sets in a tight, grim line. He is not just building a ramp for a boat. He is building a wooden shield for a boy who is just like he used to be. He is trying, with every ounce of strength left in his aging arms, to put a piece of his own hard-won survival into the grain of the timber, hoping it will be enough to deflect the dark things he knows are waiting in the water. A few yards away, bathed in the soft, spilling light of a solitary desk lamp, stands a woman named Martha. Before the shadows fell across the oceans, Martha's hands had only ever known the gentle domestic rhythms of baking bread, mending torn knees on school trousers, and turning the fragile pages of a family Bible. Now, those hands are wrapped in strips of heavy cotton to protect them from the splinters and the biting chemicals of marine glue. She wears her husband's old woolen sweater to keep out the damp river chill, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. If you were to look into the pocket of that sweater, resting right against her heart, you would find a single, folded piece of paper. It is a letter from her son. The paper is soft, the edges worn fragile and thin from being unfolded and read 100 times over in the quiet hours of the morning. She knows every loop of his handwriting, the slightly faded ink where a smudge of dirt from some unknown, faraway place has stained the page. He wrote to her about the stars over the ocean, about how big the world seemed, and about how much he missed the smell of the pine trees in their backyard. Martha takes a piece of fine grit paper and begins to smooth the outer edge of the boat's flat bottom. Her movements are slow, repetitive, and deeply tender. She works in a walking meditation. With every stroke of her hand, she is whispering a silent, desperate blessing into the wood. She imagines she is smoothing the path for her boy. She imagines she is weaving a protective spell, sealing the hole with her love, wrapping him up warm and safe against the biting salt spray. The dim light hides the tears that occasionally slip down her cheeks, catching in the fine layer of sawdust on her face. She does not stop to wipe them away. There is no time. The boats must be finished. In this dim, dust-filled air, strangers became family. The sheer weight of what they were doing stripped away all the trivial differences that had separated them in the daylight. You could see it in the countless, beautiful micro-moments of everyday heroism. It was the way Arthur, without saying a word, would step over and lend his heavy hands to lift a piece of cypress that was just too heavy for Martha to bear alone. It was the way a young girl, her face smeared with grease, would pass around a battered tin thermos of weak, lukewarm coffee, making sure every weary soul got a sip before she took one herself. It was the shared, silent glances exchanged across the wooden ribs of a boat, a look that said, "I know your back is aching. I know you are terrified. But I am here, and we will not stop." They did not speak of the news from the front lines. They did not discuss the grand strategies or the terrifying scale of the conflict. Their world was entirely reduced to the piece of wood directly in front of them, the smell of the epoxy, and the steady, comforting presence of the person working beside them. They were pouring their very souls into the timber, transforming these humble swamp boats into vessels carrying the collective, frightened heartbeat of a nation. When we look back on history, it is so incredibly easy to lose these quiet, human moments among the grand, sweeping narratives of the past. But history is not just made of turning points and vast oceans, it is made of the things people touched, the letters they carried in their pockets, and the uniforms they wore to keep themselves warm. We feel their presence most deeply in the physical echoes they left behind. Holding onto these tangible reminders helps us bridge the decades and connect with their quiet resilience. If you find comfort in touching the past, and holding onto these physical echoes, or in simply visualizing the vastness of the history they endured, I want to gently recommend a few ways to bring those stories closer to home. Through our Amazon affiliate links, you can find beautiful, authentic WWII memorabilia, small artifacts that carry the weight of that era. Or, you might find peace in spending a quiet evening watching a beautifully crafted film like Midway on Prime, which paints such a vivid, immersive picture of the terrifying oceans these little wooden boats were built to cross. It is a wonderful, grounding way to honor their memory from the safety of your own living room. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the night deepened, the silence in the boatyard seemed to grow thicker, wrapping the workers in a heavy, protective cocoon. Andrew would often walk the floor during these darkest, quietest hours. He did not bark orders. He did not hold a clipboard or inspect the lines. He walked softly, his large boots stepping carefully over the stray tools and the trailing electrical cords. He simply watched the faces in the dim light. He saw the profound, aching exhaustion etched into their postures, the way their shoulders slumped when they thought no one was looking. But he also saw a stunning, unshakable grace. He saw mothers, fathers, and grandfathers holding the line in the only way they knew how. He felt a deep, overwhelming humility wash over him. He was the man who had drawn the blueprints, the man who had fought the silent brass in Washington to allow these boats to exist. But looking at Arthur and Martha, looking at the blistered hands and the tear-streaked faces, he knew the truth. He had only provided the skeleton. These people, these quiet, beautiful, exhausted people working in the shadows, were giving the boats a soul. They were breathing life into the wood with every touch. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the quality of the light in the cavernous shed began to change. The harsh, amber glow of the arc lamps began to soften, met by the first, pale, violet streaks of dawn creeping through the high, dusty windows. The night was ending. The symphony of the night shift was winding down to its final, quiet notes. From somewhere out in the city, a whistle blew, a soft, low moan that drifted through the morning fog. The workers did not rush to the exits. They finished their tasks with the same deliberate care they had maintained all night. Tools were gently wiped down with oilcloths and placed back into worn leather rolls. The sawdust settled over the floor like a fresh blanket of snow. Martha took a clean rag and gave the hole she had been working on one last, gentle wipe, patting the smooth wood twice, just as she used to pat her son's shoulder before he left for school. Arthur gathered his heavy coat, casting a long, quiet look at the sturdy wooden ramp he had built, silently wishing it got speed. They walked out through the wide doors, stepping into the cool, humid embrace of the Louisiana morning. The sky above the river was turning a soft, bruised pink, reflecting on the dark water where dozens of newly finished boats sat bobbing on the tide. The workers vanished back into the mist of the city, returning to their quiet kitchens and their empty beds, leaving nothing behind but the scent of pine and the ghosts of their labor. Inside the shed, the lights were finally clicked off. The boats remained, silent, strong, and deeply loved, resting in the quiet morning light. They were ready for the deep water. They were ready to carry the boys home, guided by the unseen, gentle hands of the faces in the dim light. There is a profound difference between a wall that keeps the cold world out and a door that must eventually let it in. For a time, the wooden boats resting in the humid embrace of the Louisiana bayou were a masterpiece of quiet, uninterrupted protection. They had been shaped by devoted hands to glide over the submerged roots and the hidden sandbars, carrying their passengers safely through the treacherous shallows. The solid, spoon-shaped bow pushed the water away, and the high wooden sides rose up like the walls of a floating cradle. To be inside one of these boats was to feel held, safely tucked away from the unpredictable currents of the world outside. But as the shadows of conflict deepened, Andrew and the quiet men of his boatyard realized a heavy, unsettling truth. A boat designed for a peaceful marsh is a vessel of travel, a boat designed for a fractured world is a vessel of delivery. And delivery requires an exit. Imagine, for a moment, a young boy from a quiet farm, dressed in heavy, scratchy wool, weighed down by canvas packs, water canteens, and a terrible, silent fear. If this boy were to ride in the original wooden boat, his journey to the shore would be safe. But when the boat finally scraped against the sand, his sanctuary would suddenly become a trap. To leave the boat, he would have to pull his heavy, exhausted body up over the high wooden sides. He would have to balance precariously on the edge, entirely exposed to the wide, indifferent horizon, before throwing himself blindly into the churning, unpredictable surf below. It was a terrifying vulnerability. The boat, which had been built to save lives, was leaving the boys at the mercy of the deep water in their final, most crucial moment. In the dusty, golden light of the New Orleans workshop, this realization settled like a fine, heavy powder over the carpenters. They were men who dealt in solutions, men who spoke the language of wood and water. They knew the beautiful, unbroken curve of the boat's bow had to be sacrificed. They had to cut the nose off their perfect creation and replace it with something entirely new. They had to build a gate. There was a profound, quiet sorrow in this necessary alteration. Let us imagine an older shipwright, a man named Thomas, whose hands were permanently stained with the dark oil of mahogany. Thomas loved the elegant, sweeping lines of the hulls they had been building. To him, cutting into the solid, protective bow felt almost like a betrayal of the wood. But he also had a grandson whose letters from a distant training camp were arriving with increasing, nervous frequency. Thomas understood that aesthetics had no place in the grim mathematics of survival. And so, the saws bit into the wood. The high, graceful bows were carefully removed, leaving a gaping, square hole at the front of the vessel. The boat suddenly looked strange, truncated, and brutally functional. In place of the solid wood, they began to construct a ramp. It was a heavy, imposing thing. It was framed in thick, unyielding steel and faced with thick planks of waterproof pine. Heavy iron hinges were bolted deep into the hull, their joints packed with thick, dark grease to protect them from the biting salt of the ocean. Thick steel cables, woven from hundreds of individual wire strands, were strung through iron pulleys, connecting the heavy door to a mechanical winch at the back of the boat. When you stood close to it, the ramp did not smell like the warm, fragrant cypress of the bayou. It smelled of industry, of cold iron, of welding sparks, and of a harsh, unavoidable destiny. Yet, for all its mechanical brutality, this heavy door carried an immense, fragile emotional weight. When the cables were pulled tight and the ramp was raised, the boat was whole again. It became a moving fortress. It was a blind, wooden womb. The young men who would eventually stand inside these boats would not be able to see the terrifying beaches approaching. They would only see the backs of the boys standing in front of them, the grain of the wooden walls pressing in on their sides, and the sky directly above. The raised door was a shield, hiding the terror of the world from their eyes, giving them a few final, suspended minutes of nervous, collective isolation. They would listen to the water slapping against the flat bottom, the deep rumble of the diesel engine, and the ragged, shallow breathing of their friends. The door kept the fear contained. But when the boat hit the sand, that heavy iron and wood shield would fall. That was the moment the iron gates would open. The sudden, violent drop of the ramp would instantly transform the wooden sanctuary into an open stage. In the space of a single heartbeat, the dark, damp interior of the boat would be flooded with the harsh, blinding light of the beach, the deafening roar of the world, and the vast, terrifying unknown. The ramp was no longer a wall, it was a bridge. A bridge spanning the final, impossible distance between the safety of the sea and the terrifying reality of the sand. It is difficult to truly comprehend the sheer, staggering courage it took to stand behind that door, watching the thick cables tremble, knowing that at any second, the world was going to break open in front of you. Often, when we speak of these moments in history, we soften the edges. We speak in hushed, gentle tones to comfort ourselves against the overwhelming reality of what those young boys endured. But there is a time and a place for the unvarnished truth. To truly honor their quiet resilience, we must sometimes look directly at the harsh, unblurred realities they faced when those doors dropped. If you are someone who wishes to connect with the deep, unfiltered reality of this history, I want to gently recommend a visit to our Gumroad store. There, we offer a carefully preserved digital collection of unseen, raw images and videos from the war, materials that are simply too stark, too real, to be shown on this platform. It is a sobering, profoundly moving way to bear witness to the true weight of their sacrifice. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Understanding the dark makes the light of their bravery shine so much brighter. The first time they tested the new ramp in the quiet waters of the bayou, the entire boatyard seemed to hold its breath. It was late in the afternoon, the sun casting long, orange ribbons of light across the muddy river. Andrew stood on the shore, the deep lines around his eyes tight with anticipation. The modified boat came down the river, its blunt, flat nose pushing a steady wave of brown water before it. It did not look like a graceful water bird anymore. It looked like a working machine, heavy and resolute. The young man at the wheel aimed the boat directly for the sloping, grassy bank. The flat bottom slid over the shallows, the wood groaning softly as it met the soft earth, coming to a sudden, firm halt. For a moment, there was only the low, idle rumble of the engine. Then, the coxswain released the brake on the winch. The thick steel cables unspooled with a sharp, metallic whine. The heavy wooden and iron ramp fell forward. It did not hit the ground with a soft thud. It struck the muddy bank with a heavy, resonant clang, a sound that echoed across the water and disappeared into the Spanish moss of the distant cypress trees. It sounded incredibly final. It sounded like a bank vault opening, or a heavy prison door falling away. Andrew walked slowly down to the water's edge. He stepped onto the heavy wooden planks of the lowered ramp. The iron hinges held firm. The ramp did not bow or shift beneath his considerable weight. It provided a wide, flat, perfect avenue directly from the belly of the boat to the dry land. A man could walk down this ramp carrying heavy supplies, a man could drive a small vehicle down it, or a group of young men could run down it, shoulder to shoulder, never having to sink into the paralyzing, deep water of the surf. Thomas, the older carpenter who had mourned the loss of the beautiful bow, stepped up beside Andrew. He reached down and ran his calloused hand over the thick steel cable lying slack on the wood. He didn't say a word, but his eyes were wet. He saw it now. He saw that they had not destroyed the beauty of the boat, they had simply sacrificed it to create something infinitely more important. They had built a doorway to life. As the evening slowly settled over New Orleans, the factory continued its quiet, relentless hum. But there was a new reverence in the way the workers approached the boats. As they bolted the heavy hinges and threaded the steel cables, they were intensely aware of the emotional threshold they were constructing. They would run their hands along the inside of the door, smoothing the wood, knowing that young, trembling hands would soon press against this very spot, seeking comfort in the grain. They made sure every bolt was flush, every joint was tight, ensuring that when the time came, the door would not jam, the cables would not snap, and the bridge would hold. They were pouring all of their quiet, protective love into the iron and the wood. Down in the harbor, the newly finished boats were being lined up, tied securely to the wooden docks. In the fading twilight, they looked like a silent, resting army. The ramps were all pulled tightly shut, the cables taut, securing the empty spaces inside. The wombs of the vessels were sealed, waiting in the warm southern night. They were born in the quiet, gentle shadows of the bayou, shaped by the hands of mothers and grandfathers, bakers and lumbermen. But they were destined for a world of fire and salt. They bobbed gently on the tide, peaceful and strong, holding onto the heavy promise of their design. The wooden boats were ready to cross the dark oceans, and the iron gates were ready, waiting for the dawn, waiting to open up the shores of the world and carry the boys into the light. There is a moment when the sweet, heavy air of the river finally surrenders to the sharp, ancient breath of the open sea. For the wooden boats born in the humid, sheltered embrace of the Louisiana bayou, this meeting of waters was a quiet baptism. They had been shaped by hands that knew the smell of pine sap and the slow, muddy drag of the swamps. They had been built to glide over sunken logs and whisper through the tall reeds. But now, they were being sent out into a vast, terrifying expanse of blue. They were leaving the quiet cradle of the South to taste the cold, biting salt of the ocean. And they were not going alone. Standing behind the wooden steering wheels of these strange, flat-bottomed craft were boys who were just as far from home as the boats themselves. Let us imagine one of them. We will call him William. William was a boy whose eyes were used to the endless, golden oceans of wheat in the American Midwest. He had grown up with the dry, dusty wind of the plains in his hair, a boy who knew the intricate workings of a tractor engine but had only ever seen the ocean in the faded, dog-eared pages of an encyclopedia. When William first arrived at the coastal training camp, the sheer size of the water terrified him. The ocean did not behave like the quiet ponds of his childhood. It breathed. It heaved. It possessed a dark, muscular power that crashed against the shore with a deafening roar. In the early mornings, when the gray fog rolled thick over the bays, William would stand on the wooden docks, shivering in his heavy wool coat, his lungs filling with the strange, stinging scent of the salt spray. It was a smell that promised danger, a smell that spoke of distances too vast for the mind to comfortably hold. He was assigned to be a coxswain, the driver of one of the newly arrived Higgins boats. When he first stepped down into the wooden hull, his boots slipping slightly on the damp deck, he felt incredibly small. The boat was just a shell of wood and iron, floating precariously on an ocean that could swallow it whole. But as he reached out and placed his bare hands on the polished wooden wheel, something profound happened. The wood was not cold like the steel of the great battleships moored out in the deep water. The wood was warm. It held the latent, quiet energy of the forests it had come from. As William ran his fingers over the smooth grain, he felt a strange, comforting connection. He did not know the name of the carpenter in New Orleans who had spent hours sanding that very wheel, but he could feel the care that had been poured into it. In the middle of this terrifying, alien environment, the boat felt like a piece of the earth, a grounded, solid thing that had been crafted to protect him. Learning to drive the boat was not a matter of conquering the waves, but of learning to listen to them. Older, weathered sailors, men who had spent their lives reading the shifting moods of the sea, taught the young farm boys the delicate art of the shallow water. There was no shouting in these lessons. The sea was already loud enough. Instead, there were quiet words spoken close to the ear over the deep rumble of the diesel engine. The older men taught William how to feel the rhythm of the swells, how to ease the flat-bottomed boat up the back of a wave rather than smashing violently into it. They taught him that the boat was designed to skip and dance, that its lightness was its greatest strength. During the long hours of practice, driving back and forth through the churning surf, William found his courage. The salt spray would lash against his cheeks, stinging his eyes and leaving a thin, white crust of salt on his lips, but his hands remained steady on the wheel. He learned to trust the boat. He saw how the blunt, spoon-shaped bow lifted gracefully over the breaking crests, refusing to be pulled under. He felt the sturdy, maternal embrace of the high wooden sides shielding him from the wind. The terrifying ocean was still there, but William was no longer a victim to it. He was a partner in a quiet, wooden waltz. When the training exercises were finished for the day, the boys would secure the boats to the docks and retreat to their dimly lit barracks. The smell of the salt followed them, clinging to their wool blankets and their damp hair. They would sit on the edges of their cots, passing around a tin thermos of hot coffee, rubbing their tired, aching shoulders. In these quiet, evening hours, the true weight of their situation would settle over them. They knew they were not practicing for a gentle cruise. They were practicing to drive these fragile wooden shells onto hostile, tearing beaches. They were practicing to carry their friends into the fire. William would sit by the small, frosty window, a notebook resting on his knees, and write letters back to the golden plains of his home. His handwriting, usually rushed and messy, became careful and deliberate. He wrote to his father about the massive, throbbing engine of the boat, finding comfort in the shared language of mechanics. He wrote to his mother about the gulls that cried out over the water, and the strange, beautiful colors the ocean turned just before the sun went down. He never wrote about the fear. He kept the dark, creeping anxieties tucked away in the deepest corners of his heart, shielding his family from the terrible realities of the coast. Instead, he wrote about the boat. He told them how strong the wood was. He told them that when he was standing behind the wheel, breathing in the salt air, he felt safe. It was an act of profound, everyday heroism, a young boy wrapping his own fears in comforting words to protect the people he loved, finding his solace in a few planks of southern mahogany. So much of what happened in those coastal camps, the quiet moments of bravery, the secret harbors, and the hidden operations that prepared these boys for the world stage, are often lost to the grand sweep of history. We remember the battles, but we forget the quiet nights spent learning to breathe in the salt. If you find peace in uncovering these hidden whispers of the past and shining a light on the quiet heroes who operated in the shadows, I would love to warmly invite you to join our email newsletter. As a welcome gift, I will send you a free copy of our ebook, The Shadow War: 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. Every week, we take gentle deep dives into the forgotten facts and the unseen moments that shaped our world. It is a wonderful, peaceful community of history lovers, and I would be honored to share it with you. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the weeks turned into months, the young boys in the training camps were quietly transformed. They arrived as bakers, mechanics, and farmers, but the salt and the wind slowly carved them into something new. They were the coxswains. They were the keepers of the wooden boats. The fear never completely vanished. It simply became a quiet companion, sitting right beside them as they steered. They learned to rely on each other in ways they had never imagined. When one boy's hands were too frozen to tie a heavy mooring line, another pair of hands would silently appear in the mist to take the rope. When the homesickness became a physical ache in the chest, there was always a friend willing to sit on the dock and watch the dark water until the feeling passed. They were bound together by the wood and the water. There was a particular night, just before the orders arrived to pack up the camps and head for the troopships, that William stood alone on the dock. The camp was asleep. The only sound was the rhythmic, soothing slap 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 of the dark water against the flat bottoms of the Higgins boats. The moon cast a pale, silver path across the ocean, leading out toward a horizon that held unimaginable trials. William looked down at the boat he had been assigned. It bobbed gently, patiently waiting for him. He stepped down into the hull one last time in the quiet of the night. He didn't turn on the engine. He just stood behind the wheel, resting his hands on the familiar grain of the wood. He took a deep, slow breath, pulling the cold, salty air deep into his lungs. It didn't sting anymore. It smelled like resolve. It smelled like duty. He thought of the men and women down in New Orleans, the people who had sweated and bled to build this vessel. He thought of his parents, sleeping safely beneath the vast, starry sky of the plains. And he thought of the boys sleeping in the barracks behind him, the boys who would soon be crowding into this very hull, trusting him to bring them safely to the sand. The wooden boat was a bridge that connected all of them. It was a floating promise made of cypress and steel. As the gentle tide rocked the boat back and forth, a soothing, hypnotic lullaby, William closed his eyes. He was no longer a frightened boy from the prairies. He was a piece of a grand, quiet symphony. He patted the wooden dashboard, a gentle gesture of affection and partnership, ready to cross the dark oceans, ready to carry the weight of the world, and ready to face whatever the dawn might bring. There is a stillness that falls over the ocean just before the world breaks open, a heavy, breathless quiet that settles deep into the marrow of the bone. Far away from the sheltering arms of the Louisiana bayous, the waters of the Pacific stretched out like an endless, undulating canvas of bruised sapphire. This was a beautiful, ancient ocean, a place of vibrant, terrifying colors and deeply hidden secrets. Beneath the sparkling, turquoise surface of the shallows lay jagged forests of ancient coral, sharp enough to tear the steel belly from a mighty warship. The air here did not smell of the sweet pine and damp earth of the American South. It smelled of brine, of crushed shells, and of a tropical heat that wrapped around the skin like a heavy, damp woolen blanket. Through this vast and alien expanse, the wooden boats of Andrew Higgins moved like quiet, determined ghosts. Inside the high wooden walls of these vessels, the world was reduced to shadows and the muffled, rhythmic thrumming of a diesel engine. The boys standing shoulder to shoulder in the hull were so incredibly young. Their faces, smeared with the dark paste of camouflage, were the faces of farmhands, delivery boys, and quiet students who had, only a season ago, been worrying about nothing more than school dances and the autumn harvest. Now, they were pressed together in the dim light, swaying in unison as the flat-bottomed boat rose and fell on the ocean swells. To be inside that boat was to be suspended in a terrifying, suffocating waiting room. The heavy iron ramp at the front was raised tight, sealing them in. They could not see the palm trees, or the white sand, or the dark plumes of smoke rising on the horizon. They could only look at the rusted buckles on the canvas pack of the boy standing directly in front of them. The air was thick with the scent of gun oil, damp wool, and the unmistakable, metallic tang of fear. But surrounding them, cradling them in this most desperate hour, was the wood. A young boy, let us call him Henry, stood near the starboard side. His hands, pale and trembling, were gripping his rifle so tightly his knuckles ached. The fear in his chest was a living, fluttering thing, like a trapped bird beating its wings against his ribs. He closed his eyes and leaned his shoulder, just a fraction of an inch, against the side of the boat. Through the rough fabric of his uniform, he could feel the solid, unyielding warmth of the Philippine mahogany. The wood vibrated with the steady heartbeat of the engine. In that moment of overwhelming terror, the wood felt like an anchor. Henry slowly uncurled one of his trembling fingers and traced the grain of the timber. He thought of the carpenter back in New Orleans, a man he would never meet, who had sanded this very board. He thought of his grandfather's porch back home, how the sun used to bake the wooden floorboards, making them warm beneath his bare feet. The boat, built from the familiar earth of his homeland, felt almost maternal. It was a wooden shield, holding back the vast, indifferent ocean, keeping the boy safe and dry in its hollow belly. Beside Henry stood a boy named Samuel. Samuel was staring straight ahead, his breathing shallow and erratic. He was trying so desperately to be brave, to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over his dark eyelashes. Henry did not speak. There were no words that could possibly ease the weight of what was coming. Instead, Henry simply shifted his weight as the boat rocked, allowing his shoulder to bump gently against Samuel's. He left it there, pressing firmly. It was a small, quiet tether in the dark. It said, "I am here. You are not alone. We will face this together." Samuel let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned back against Henry. A private, beautiful moment of everyday heroism, hidden away in the shadows of a wooden box. Beneath them, the water began to change. The deep, rolling swells of the open ocean gave way to the sharp, choppy chop of the coral reefs. The boat began to shudder. The heavy steel ships of the fleet had been forced to stop far out in the deep water, terrified of the jagged coral that lurked just beneath the surface. But the Higgins boat was born for the shallows. It did not try to push the coral out of its way. The blunt, spoon-shaped bow met the submerged reef and simply rode up over it. The boys inside could hear the agonizing, scraping sound of the coral tearing at the flat wooden bottom. It was a terrible, screeching noise that vibrated up through their boots. But the wood held. It was bruised, it was battered, but it refused to break. The flexibility of the southern timber absorbed the shock, allowing the boat to skip and slide over the treacherous reef, carrying its precious cargo closer to the shore. The ocean holds millions of these quiet, untold stories. It guards the memories of frightened boys finding comfort against a wooden wall, and the silent, invisible bonds of friendship forged in the darkest of hours. Digging through the sands of time to find these deeply human moments, to ensure these ghosts of the Pacific are never forgotten, is a labor of profound love. It requires countless hours of gentle, careful research. If you find peace in hearing these stories, and if you would like to help support the massive time it takes to keep this history alive, I would be so incredibly grateful if you might consider leaving a small tip, even as little as $1, on our Ko-Fi page. It is your kindness that allows this sanctuary of memory to exist. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the boat cleared the final reef, the terrible, scraping sound faded, replaced by the rushing hiss of the surf. The water beneath them was no longer blue, it was a pale, churning jade, frothing with white foam. The shore was agonizingly close now. Inside the boat, the tension wrapped around the boys like a tightened wire. The waiting was almost over. Henry reached up with his free hand and touched the edge of his helmet. Tucked carefully beneath the webbing was a small, folded letter from his mother. It smelled faintly of lavender and the cedar box where she kept her stationery. He pressed his fingers against it, drawing one last measure of strength from her words. At the back of the boat, the young coxswain, a boy whose face was pale and tight with concentration, gripped the wooden wheel. He watched the waves, timing their approach. He felt the exact moment the flat bottom of the hull scraped against the soft, wet sand of the beach. The boat surged forward on the crest of a wave and ground to a sudden, heavy halt. The engine roared as the coxswain held the boat steady against the pulling tide. And then, he reached for the heavy iron lever. The metallic clank of the latch releasing echoed like a gunshot inside the wooden walls. The thick steel cables groaned, and the heavy iron and wood ramp fell forward. The dark, insulated world of the hull was instantly shattered. The blinding, brilliant light of the tropical sun flooded into the boat. The suffocating silence was ripped away, replaced by the deafening, chaotic roar of the world outside. The smell of the humid jungle, of burning smoke, and of the salty spray washed over their faces. For one suspended heartbeat, the boys just stood there, looking out the open doorway. The ramp had formed a perfect, solid bridge over the deep water, leading directly onto the wet sand. The boat had done exactly what Andrew Higgins had dreamed it would do. It had carried them through the impossible reefs, shielded them from the deep water, and laid a path beneath their feet. Henry took a breath, feeling Samuel's shoulder leave his side as the line of boys began to move forward. He stepped out of the shadows and onto the ramp. His boots hit the wood, then the iron lip, and finally, the soft, shifting sand of a strange and terrifying world. He didn't look back. But if he had, he would have seen the wooden boat bobbing faithfully in the surf. It looked small against the vastness of the Pacific, its paint chipped and its hull scarred by the coral. But it held its ground. The engine hummed a steady, deep rhythm, fighting the tide to keep the ramp pressed against the shore. It waited there in the churning water, a steadfast, wooden friend from a distant bayou, watching its boys walk away into the light, praying for the day it could finally carry them all back home. There is a specific kind of cold that settles over the sea just before the morning breaks, a damp, heavy chill that sinks not into the skin, but deep into the quiet spaces of the soul. The English Channel in the early days of June is not a gentle body of water. It is a restless, churning expanse of dark gray, endlessly folding in on itself, carrying the bitter memories of ancient winter storms. On this particular morning, beneath a sky completely devoid of stars, the water was a vast, shifting canvas of ink. The air was thick with a biting mist that clung to everything it touched, turning woolen coats heavy and damp, and leaving a thin, salty sheen on the faces of thousands of young men who sat waiting in the dark. If you were to look out across the water in those pre-dawn hours, you would not see the horizon. You would only see the massive, imposing silhouettes of troopships rising out of the mist like silent, floating iron mountains. But the true story of this morning was not happening on those grand, steel decks. It was happening in the small, wooden shadows hanging precariously over the side. Suspended by thick ropes and heavy iron davits, swaying gently in the cold wind, were the Higgins boats. Inside these small, flat-bottomed wooden vessels, the world had been reduced to a space no larger than a modest living room. But into this space, the heavy, frightened breath of an entire generation was pressed. Imagine sitting shoulder to shoulder in that cramped, wooden belly. The boys around you are barely more than shadows. You cannot see their eyes clearly, but you can hear them. You can hear the short, shallow breaths. You can hear the soft, metallic clink of a canteen rubbing against a canvas strap. You can hear the quiet, murmured whispers of a prayer, spoken so softly it seems meant only for the collar of the boy's own coat. Let us focus on one of these shadows. A boy named Arthur. He is 19 years old, with hands that have only ever known the soft, yielding dirt of a quiet farm in Ohio. He sits with his knees pulled tightly together, his chin tucked down into the rough collar of his jacket, trying to escape the biting wind that whistles over the high wooden sides of the boat. Beneath his heavy layers, tucked safely into the breast pocket of his uniform, directly over his heart, is a letter. It arrived 2 weeks ago. The paper is soft and worn, having been folded and unfolded countless times. It is from his mother, writing about the spring rain, about how the dog misses him, and about the cherry tree blossoming in the backyard. In this freezing, terrifying darkness, that small square of paper is the heaviest thing Arthur carries. It is his tether to a world that makes sense, a warm, bright anchor in an ocean of gray. He presses his cold fingers against the fabric of his pocket, just to feel the outline of it. Beside Arthur sits a boy he only met a few days ago. A boy from the crowded, noisy streets of a city Arthur has never seen. They have nothing in common but their age and the wooden walls surrounding them. But as the boat takes a sudden, violent sway on the ropes, the city boy's shoulder knocks hard against Arthur's. The boy doesn't pull away. He leaves his shoulder pressed there, a solid, grounding weight in the shifting dark. He reaches into his pocket, pulls out a single, slightly bruised stick of peppermint gum, breaks it perfectly in half with his thumbnail, and offers a piece to Arthur without saying a word. Arthur takes it. He places it on his tongue, the sharp, clean taste of the mint cutting through the overwhelming smell of diesel fuel and sea salt. It is such a small, fragile moment of kindness. But in the grand, terrifying sweep of history, it is these tiny, quiet acts of shared humanity that truly carry us through the dark. Then, the heavy winches on the ship above them begin to turn. The sound is a loud, agonizing groan of straining metal. The wooden boat begins to descend toward the black water. The dropping sensation is terrifying, a slow, helpless plunge into the abyss. Arthur closes his eyes. He feels the sudden, hard slap of the flat wooden bottom hitting the crest of a wave. The boat shudders, groans, and then settles into the water. They are cast off. The ropes are pulled away, and the boat is suddenly alone, a tiny wooden leaf tossed into a churning, violent washing machine. The engine roars to life, a deep, vibrating hum that shakes the floorboards. The boat begins to push forward, beginning its slow, agonizing circle in the water, waiting for the others to join. It is here, in the freezing, tossing water of the English Channel, that the true miracle of Andrew Higgins' design reveals itself. The deep-water Navy men had scoffed at this boat. They had called it a swamp toy. But as the violent, chaotic waves of the channel smash against the sides, the boat does not sink. The warm, southern wood, the mahogany and the cypress born in the humid, tranquil bayous of Louisiana, flexes and groans, but it holds tight. It was built by hands that understood the unpredictable nature of water. It dances over the swells. It absorbs the shock. It cradles the frightened boys in its wooden arms, a steadfast protector in an indifferent sea. To preserve the memory of these moments, to look closely at the unvarnished truth of what these boys endured in the dark, is a profound responsibility. It is so deeply important to remember them not just as statues of bronze, but as fragile, frightened young men seeking comfort in a piece of peppermint gum and a wooden wall. If you feel a connection to these deeply human stories and wish to explore the quiet corners of history where the true heart of humanity resides, I warmly invite you to join our Patreon community. It is a peaceful, dedicated space where we offer free, immersive podcasts and share raw, unblurred video sections that honor the true, unfiltered reality of these historical moments. There is also a tip jar for those who wish to support the massive amount of research it takes to bring these stories to light. It is a wonderful community of history lovers, and we would be honored to have you. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. As the hours crawl by, the absolute blackness of the night begins to thin. It is not a beautiful sunrise. There are no brilliant streaks of gold or pink painting the clouds. It is simply a slow, hesitant bleeding of pale gray into the dark. The shadows inside the boat begin to take on shapes. Arthur can finally see the face of the boy next to him. His skin is pale, his lips blue from the cold, and his eyes are wide, reflecting the churning gray water. The boys are thoroughly exhausted. The constant, violent pitching of the flat-bottomed boat has made many of them violently ill. The smell of sickness mixes with the diesel and the salt, a grim perfume of anticipation. They huddle lower, trying to hide behind the high wooden sides of the hull as the wind whips the tops of the waves, sending icy spray raining down on their helmets. Through the mist, the gray dawn reveals the staggering reality of their situation. As Arthur looks over the shoulder of the boy in front of him, he sees them. Hundreds, thousands of identical wooden boats, bobbing and weaving through the choppy water, all pointing in the same direction. It is a silent, wooden armada, pushing relentlessly through the gloom. And then, far off in the distance, a darker shade of gray appears on the horizon. It is a thin, jagged smudge against the pale sky. It is the coast. A quiet, collective shiver runs through the boat. The waiting is coming to an end. The abstract fear of the night is solidifying into the terrifying reality of the morning. Arthur reaches up and checks the heavy strap of his helmet. He checks the safety on his rifle. And then, his hand drops down to his chest, pressing one last time against the pocket where the letter rests. He thinks of the cherry tree. He thinks of his mother standing at the kitchen window. He pulls a deep, slow breath of the freezing, salty air into his lungs, trying to steady the frantic beating of his heart. The heavy iron ramp at the front of the boat is still raised tight, a solid, comforting wall between the boys and the world. For just a few more minutes, they are safe. For just a few more minutes, the wood of the Louisiana bayou holds them, a gentle, protective embrace in a cold, unforgiving world. The engine hums its steady, working-class song, the flat bottom slaps against the English waves, and the boys ride the gray dawn, holding their breath, waiting for the gates to open. The shoreline is where the ocean's long, restless journey finally breaks against the earth, leaving behind the shattered pieces of 1,000 quiet prayers. When the flat, wooden bottom of the Higgins boat finally met the shore, there was no gentle, welcoming embrace. There was only the sudden, heavy grinding of timber against wet sand, a deep, resonant shudder that traveled up from the earth, through the hull, and into the weary bones of the boys standing inside. The great, terrifying expanse of the water was behind them now, replaced by a strange, fog-shrouded world of shadows and distant, echoing thunder. The heavy iron ramp fell forward, crashing into the shallow surf, and the insulated, silent sanctuary of the boat was instantly broken wide open. If you were to stand on that beach in the gray, weeping mist, you would not see the neat, orderly lines of a parade ground. You would see a chaotic, swirling canvas of human vulnerability. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning oil, churning salt water, and the damp, heavy wool of 1,000 uniforms. But even in the midst of this overwhelming storm, if you looked closely, you could find the quiet, beautiful moments of an everyday heroism that the history books so often forget to mention. Let us stay for a moment with the boat, and with the young man who was tasked to stay behind its wooden wheel. Let us call him David. David was a quiet boy, possessing the steady, calloused hands of a mechanic and the gentle, observant eyes of someone who preferred listening to speaking. While the other boys rushed forward, pouring out of the wooden belly and disappearing into the mist of the shoreline, David's duty was to remain. He had to keep the heavy diesel engine humming, holding the boat steady against the relentless pulling of the tide, keeping the ramp firmly pressed into the sand so that no one would stumble into the deep water. He stood there in the empty hull, his hands gripping the mahogany wool so tightly his knuckles shone pale white in the gloom. The boat, which only moments ago had been filled with the warm, nervous breathing of his friends, was suddenly hollow and vast. It felt like a house just after a family has moved away, leaving behind only the echoes of their lives. He looked down at the wooden floorboards, scarred by the heavy boots that had just crossed them, and he felt a profound, aching loneliness wash over him. But David was not entirely alone. He had the wood. The boat was taking a beating. The surf was rough, lifting the flat bottom and dropping it repeatedly against the hard, unyielding ridges of the sandbank. And the storm of the world was raging around them. Debris and unseen fragments from the chaos beyond the mist whipped through the air. Suddenly, there was a sharp, cracking sound just inches from David's arm. It was not the deafening boom of the artillery, but a dry, intimate sound, like a large winter branch snapping under the weight of heavy snow. David flinched, pulling his shoulder down. When he opened his eyes, he looked at the high wooden wall of the boat, right where his head had been resting just a moment before. The thick, solid plank of Philippine mahogany had been struck. A jagged, deep gouge had been torn into the wood, sending a spray of sharp, pale splinters cascading across the deck. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and ran his fingertips over the broken grain. The wood was warm. It had absorbed the violent impact. It had caught the fragment that was meant for him, swallowing the danger deep into its dense, fibrous heart. The wood had splintered, it had scarred, but it had not shattered. It had held the line. In that quiet, suspended moment, with the roar of the world rushing past his ears, David felt an overwhelming, tearful wave of gratitude. He thought of the unseen hands back in the humid, peaceful boatyards of New Orleans. He thought of the men in overalls and the women with their hair tied back in cotton scarves, people who had spent their days carefully selecting these timbers, gluing the joints, and driving the screws. They had never met him. They did not know his name, or the color of his eyes, or the quiet farm he had left behind. Yet, they had built a fortress for him. They had sent a piece of the American South across the dark ocean to stand between him and the storm. He picked up a small, jagged splinter of the mahogany from the floorboards. It was no larger than a matchstick, pale and rough, smelling faintly of the bayou and the sea. He slipped it carefully into his breast pocket, tucking it away right next to his heart, a tiny, physical piece of salvation to carry with him into whatever tomorrow might bring. It is profoundly moving to think about these physical echoes of history, a splinter of mahogany, a rusted canteen, a faded photograph, that connect us to the quiet courage of that morning. Holding onto these tangible pieces helps us bridge the vast decades, allowing us to feel the weight of their resilience in our own hands. If you find peace in feeling that physical connection to the past, I want to warmly recommend taking a look at our Amazon affiliate links. You can find beautiful, authentic WWII memorabilia to honor their memory and keep their stories close to your heart. Or, perhaps, you might spend a quiet evening watching a beautifully crafted film like WWII on Prime, which paints such a sweeping, immersive picture of the history these men lived through. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Embracing these echoes is a wonderful way to ensure their quiet sacrifices are never forgotten. As David stood by the wheel, the true miracle of Andrew Higgins' stubborn dream began to unfold right there in the shallow, foaming water. Through the mist, David saw a shape emerging from the shoreline. It was one of the boys who had just left the boat. He was struggling, stumbling backward into the surf, his arm wrapped heavily around the shoulders of another boy who could barely walk. They were exhausted, weighed down by the heavy, wet wool of their uniforms and the sheer, overwhelming terror of the beach. The water around them was churning, gray, and bitterly cold. If Andrew Higgins had not fought the brass in Washington, if the Navy had been allowed to send these boys in their heavy, deep-drafted steel ships, those ships would have been forced to drop their ramps hundreds of yards out into the ocean, terrified of running aground on the sandbars. Those exhausted, stumbling boys would have been trying to navigate deep, treacherous water, a burden far too heavy for their tired bodies to bear. But Higgins had built a swamp boat. He had built a vessel that danced over the sandbars. Because of the flat, spoon-shaped bottom, David's boat was resting comfortably in water that was barely knee-deep. The two boys waded through the gentle, shallow wash of the surf. They didn't have to swim. They didn't have to fight the heavy, drowning pull of the deep ocean. They simply put one foot in front of the other, feeling the solid, reassuring packed sand beneath the water, until they reached the heavy iron ramp. David rushed forward, abandoning the wheel for just a few seconds. He reached down, his hands grasping the rough, wet canvas of their jackets, and pulled them up onto the wooden deck. They collapsed against the side of the hull, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. They were safe. The high wooden walls rose up around them, blocking out the wind and the terrible sights of the shore. The boat wrapped its wooden arms around them, a floating sanctuary in the midst of the chaos. One of the boys, his face pale and smeared with wet sand, looked up at David. He didn't have the strength to speak, but his eyes conveyed a lifetime of gratitude. He reached out and pressed his trembling hand flat against the side of the hull, leaning his cheek against the wood. He closed his eyes, simply breathing in the smell of the diesel and the damp timber, finding an impossible, quiet peace in the belly of the vessel that had refused to let him drown. The tide was beginning to pull back, a slow, inevitable retreat of the ocean. David knew it was time. He returned to the wheel and engaged the heavy iron lever. The thick steel cables whined, and the ramp slowly lifted out of the water, sealing the boat shut once more. He threw the engine into reverse. The wooden hull groaned, grinding against the sandbank, protesting the friction. For a terrible second, David thought they were stuck, permanently anchored to this gray, weeping shore. But the boat was designed to be restless. It was designed to slip away. With a final, deep surge of the diesel engine, the flat bottom slid backward off the sand, floating free in the churning surf. David turned the wheel, pointing the blunt bow back out toward the dark, endless horizon, back toward the silent, floating iron mountains waiting in the mist. The boat was empty of its initial cargo, but it was not returning empty. It carried the two exhausted boys sleeping against its ribs. It carried the scars of the morning, the deep, jagged splinters torn from its side. And it carried a profound, undeniable victory. As the shoreline faded away behind them, dissolving back into the gray mist like a terrible, fleeting dream, David let out a long, slow breath. The tension that had held his body rigid for hours finally began to melt away, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. He listened to the steady, comforting rhythm of the engine, a sound he would remember for the rest of his life. He reached into his pocket and touched the small piece of splintered mahogany. Thousands of miles away, in the warm, humid twilight of Louisiana, the carpenters and the mothers were likely sleeping, completely unaware of the miracles their hands had just performed. They had built a boat to conquer the muddy, shallow bayous, and in doing so, they had given the boys of the world a bridge over the darkest waters they would ever face. The wood had held. The sand had been crossed. And the boat sailed on, a bruised but unbroken veteran, breathing in the salt, and quietly carrying its ghosts back home. There is a profound, exhausting silence that follows the end of a great storm, a quiet so deep and heavy it almost rings in the ears. For years, the world had been caught in a relentless, terrifying current, pulled forward by the deafening roar of engines, the pounding of steel, and the collective, frightened heartbeat of millions. But tides, no matter how powerful, cannot rise forever. Eventually, the moon releases its pull, the wind softens to a whisper, and the water begins its long, slow retreat back into the deep. When the news of peace finally reached the humid, winding bayous of Louisiana, it did not arrive with a sudden, triumphant explosion. It arrived more like a gentle exhalation, a long, collective breath released by a people who had been holding it for far too long. In the massive, sprawling boatyards of New Orleans, the change began in the late afternoon. The air inside the vast wooden sheds was thick, as always, with the golden haze of sawdust and the sharp, familiar scent of marine epoxy. Thousands of men and women were standing at their stations, their hands moving with the automatic, exhausted grace they had perfected over the long years. And then, the great steam whistle atop the main factory roof blew. It was not the short, sharp blast that signaled the end of a shift. It was a long, low, continuous moan that drifted out over the brown waters of the Mississippi River, carrying out across the marshes and weaving through the hanging curtains of Spanish moss. Slowly, one by one, the workers stopped. The high, frantic scream of the circular saws wound down into a sluggish hum, and then, finally, into stillness. The heavy drop hammers came to rest. The constant, vibrating roar of the engines being tested in the water simply ceased. For the first time in years, you could hear the gentle lapping of the river against the wooden docks. You could hear the distant, comforting call of a seagull. Imagine Arthur, the older carpenter with hands scarred by a lifetime of labor. He had spent the last several years pouring all of his silent, protective prayers into the wooden ramps he built, hoping they would be strong enough to shelter boys he would never meet. When the machine stopped, Arthur stood by his workbench, his calloused hand resting softly on a half-finished plank of mahogany. He didn't cheer. He didn't throw his hat into the air. He simply closed his eyes, lowered his head, and let out a trembling breath. The heavy, invisible burden he had carried in his aging shoulders seemed to simply melt away into the sawdust at his feet. Across the room, Clara, the mother who had learned to wield an electric sander to feel closer to her son across the ocean, slowly untied the heavy cotton scarf from her hair. She reached into the pocket of her faded apron, taking out the worn, folded photograph of her boy. The war was over. He was safe. The wood she had shaped had done its job. She sank down onto a small wooden stool, the tears she had held back for so long finally spilling over her cheeks, tracing clean, wet lines through the fine layer of dust on her face. It was a symphony of sawdust coming to its final, peaceful rest. The workers began to clean their tools. There was a slow, reverent tenderness in the way they moved. Arthur took a piece of oiled cloth and gently wiped down his favorite hand plane, smoothing away the grit and the resin. He wrapped his chisels carefully in soft leather. These were the instruments that had built an armada, the simple, honest tools of working people who had quietly saved the world from the shadows of their own hometown. As they swept the floors and packed their bags, there was a profound sense of completion, a quiet, shared understanding that they had given everything they had, and it had been enough. Far away from the tranquil bayou, resting on the quieted beaches of the world, were the boats themselves. The wooden Higgins boats were not built to last forever. They were not grand, iron monuments designed to sail the oceans for decades. They were built for a single, desperate purpose. They were built to bridge the gap, to take the punishment of the coral and the sand, and to carry the boys through the fire. Now that the fire was out, their job was done. Many of them were left behind on those distant shores. They sat in the soft, white sand of the Pacific Islands and the cold, gray dunes of Europe. Over the coming months and years, the ocean would slowly begin to reclaim them. The salt spray would bleach the warm Philippine mahogany into a pale, ghostly silver. The tides would wash gently against the flat bottoms, carrying away the scent of diesel and replacing it with the smell of kelp and brine. There is a beautiful, melancholic poetry in this. The boats had been born from the earth, shaped by the hands of lumbermen from the deep woods, and now they were quietly returning to nature. They became shelters for small crabs and resting places for tired seabirds. The wood, which had absorbed the terror and the bravery of a generation, now absorbed only the warm sun and the gentle rain. They rested there like quiet, wooden ghosts, watching the horizons they had once conquered, fading slowly into the landscape of peace. When the world finally goes quiet, it is incredibly easy to let the harsh realities of what those boats and those boys endured fade into the mist. We so often soften the edges of the past, preferring to remember the relief of the peace rather than the terrible, unvarnished truth of the storm. But there is a profound, grounding respect in bearing witness to their true struggle. To understand the depth of their relief, we must sometimes look closely at what they survived. If you are someone who wishes to look closely, to see the history as it truly was, I have created a quiet space for you. In our Gumroad store, I offer a carefully preserved digital collection of unseen, raw images and videos from the war, materials that capture the uncensored reality of the era, which are simply too restricted to share on this platform. It is a deeply moving way to honor their resilience and keep their truth alive. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. Back in New Orleans, the days began to shorten, the sweltering heat of the summer giving way to the soft, golden light of autumn. The massive factories slowly powered down. The corrugated tin sheds that had once echoed with the deafening roar of industry began to feel vast and empty. Andrew Higgins, the stubborn lumberman who had refused to let the world drown, walked alone through the quiet yard. He was an older man now. The years of fighting the brass, of carrying the immense, crushing weight of production, and of worrying for the lives of countless young strangers had etched deep, permanent lines into his face. He walked down to the water's edge, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The river flowed past him, wide, brown, and indifferent, just as it had before the madness began. A few empty, unfinished holes rested near the docks, their ribs exposed like the skeletons of sleeping giants. Andrew reached out and rested his large, heavy hand on the smooth curve of a wooden bow. He didn't feel the urgent, vibrating energy that used to live in the timber. He felt only the quiet, sleepy warmth of the wood resting in the sun. He looked out across the water, watching a white egret glide silently over the reeds. He had not built his boats for glory. He had not built them to conquer nations. He had built them because he saw a problem in the water, and he knew how to fix it. He had built them to bring people home. And now, they were coming home. In quiet towns across the country, young men were stepping off trains, wearing uniforms that suddenly felt too heavy and too warm. They carried canvas duffel bags and a silence that only those who had been there could truly understand. Imagine one of these boys, a young coxswain who had driven a wooden boat through the terrifying surf of the Pacific. He walks down the dirt road toward his family's farmhouse. The evening air is cool and smells of wood smoke and dried corn. He steps up onto the front porch. Before he reaches for the door handle, he stops. He looks down at the wooden railing of the porch. It is old, weathered pine, smooth and gray from years of wind and rain. He reaches out and rests his hand on it. His fingers trace the familiar, rising grain of the wood. In that simple, quiet touch, a flood of memory washes over him. He feels the steering wheel of his Higgins boat. He feels the solid, protective wall that kept him safe in the dark. He feels the profound, unspoken bond between the trees that grew in the earth, the men and women who shaped them in the bayou, and the life he has been given back. He leaves his hand there for a long moment, simply breathing in the twilight, whispering a silent thank you to the wood. The world was bruised, and it would take a very long time to heal. But the tide had finally receded. The storm had broken. Down in the Louisiana marsh, the night falls softly. The cicadas begin their rhythmic, hypnotic thrum. The bullfrogs call out from the muddy banks. The dark, amber water flows gently past the ancient roots of the cypress trees, whispering the old, forgotten secrets of the swamp. It is a world at peace, resting beneath a blanket of southern stars, knowing that when the world needed a miracle, it was the quiet, stubborn spirit of the bayou that answered the call, and carried them all safely to the shore. There is a gentle, fading beauty in watching the things we build slowly return to the quiet earth from which they came. Time moves differently in the deep, humid embrace of the Louisiana bayou. It does not march forward with the sharp, rigid tick of a clock. Instead, it flows, slow and heavy, like the dark, amber waters of the Mississippi River sliding endlessly toward the sea. Years have passed since the great, echoing halls of the boatyard shook the banks of the river. The massive corrugated sheds, once alive with the deafening, urgent symphony of sawdust and the desperate prayers of thousands of workers, have finally gone quiet. The great storm of the world has passed, and the heavy, velvet silence of the southern evening has reclaimed the marsh. Andrew is an older man now. The restless, fiery energy that once drove him to travel to the cold, marble halls of Washington, the stubborn pride that forced him to fight the immovable admirals of the Navy, has softened. It has settled into a warm, quiet ember. When he walks down the wooden planks of his dock, his step is a little slower, a little heavier. He leans against the railing and looks out over the water, watching the pale mist gather around the ancient, twisted roots of the cypress trees. Men who shape the course of the world usually leave behind grand, towering monuments. They are immortalized in cold, polished marble, and towering statues of bronze that stand defiant against the rain and the wind in the great squares of capital cities. But Andrew was a lumberman. He was a man of the woods, and he understood the profound, unspoken truth of the trees. His legacy was built of Philippine mahogany and southern pine. Wood is a living, breathing thing. It was never meant to conquer time. It was meant to serve, to endure a specific, terrible storm, and then, gracefully, to bow to the turning of the seasons. If you were to travel to the far edges of the world today, to the quiet, windswept beaches of Normandy or the silent, tropical shores of the Pacific Islands, you would not find pristine museums dedicated to his boats. Instead, resting softly in the white sand, or half buried beneath the tall, swaying dune grass, you would find the remnants of his invincible wooden fleet. The salt and the sun have bleached the warm timber to a pale, ghostly silver. The paint has long since peeled away, returning to the wind. Small, colorful crabs find shelter in the shadows of the rusted iron hinges, and tired seabirds nest in the hollows where frightened young men once stood shoulder to shoulder. The boats are dissolving, slowly and peacefully, surrendering their strength back to the earth and the ocean. To a passing eye, they might look like the forgotten ribs of some ancient, sleeping creature. But they are not forgotten. They are quiet shrines of survival. Andrew does not mourn the decay of his boats. He knows that true permanence is not found in objects that last forever. It is found in the fragile, beautiful lives those objects allow to continue. Let us travel far away from the quiet bayou, to a small, warmly lit farmhouse resting in the golden plains of the American Midwest. The evening sun is casting long, peaceful shadows across the fields of wheat. Sitting on the front porch, in a gently rocking wooden chair, is William. He is no longer the terrified, shivering farm boy who learned to breathe in the salt and steer a flat-bottomed boat through the churning, violent surf. He is a grandfather now. His hair is white, and his hands are weathered by decades of peaceful harvests. In his lap sits his youngest granddaughter, a little girl with bright eyes and a soft, unrestrained laugh. She is tracing the deep lines on his palm with her tiny finger. William looks down at her, and a profound, overwhelming wave of gratitude washes over him. He listens to the wind rustling through the wheat, a sound that sometimes, in the quietest hours, still reminds him of the whispering sea. He knows, with a deep and silent certainty, that this beautiful, peaceful moment exists only because of a few planks of southern mahogany. He knows that this little girl, and the children she will one day have, are breathing the evening air solely because a stubborn lumberman built a wooden ramp that dropped at the exact right moment, carrying him safely over the deep water and onto the sand. William doesn't need a marble statue to remember. The monument to the Higgins boat is sitting right there in his lap, laughing in the golden twilight. There are thousands of homes just like William's, scattered across the quiet corners of the world. In the dim, warm light of kitchens and living rooms, mothers who once sanded wooden holes until their hands bled are now peacefully baking bread for their grandchildren. The boys who pressed their trembling shoulders against the wooden walls of the boats are now fathers, teaching their own sons how to fish in quiet, still lakes. The survival of an entire generation is woven invisibly into the fabric of everyday life, a quiet, breathing legacy that stretches far beyond the muddy banks of New Orleans. It is a deeply hidden kind of history. It is the kind of story that doesn't scream from the crowded pages of heavy textbooks or echo in the grand halls of museums. It whispers. It whispers from the fading grain of old wood, from the folded, tear-stained letters kept safely in dusty attic trunks, and from the quiet, unspoken gratitude of a grandfather watching the sunset. So much of the truest, most beautiful parts of our past are like this, hidden in the soft shadows, just waiting for someone to sit quietly, breathe deeply, and listen. If you are someone who finds a sense of peace in sitting with these quiet whispers, if you feel a connection to the unseen, everyday heroism that truly shaped the world we live in, I would love to warmly invite you to join our email newsletter. As a welcome gift, I will send you a free copy of our ebook, The Shadow War: 5 Top Secret Operations That Shaped World War II. Every week, we take gentle, relaxing deep dives into these forgotten facts, bringing the hidden stories of the past out of the shadows and into the soft light. It is a wonderful, comforting community of people who care about remembering the quiet heroes. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It would be a true honor to share these peaceful journeys into the past with you. As the evening deepens over the Louisiana marsh, the air grows cooler, carrying the sweet, heavy scent of night-blooming jasmine. Andrew sits on his porch, a single, soft yellow light burning in the window behind him. Resting on the small wooden table beside his chair is a stack of letters. They arrive every week, year after year. They are written on different kinds of paper, in different hands. Some are written in the shaky, deliberate cursive of aging mothers, others in the tight, neat script of men who once wore uniforms. They are letters from the Williams, the Claras, the Arthurs, and the Marthas of the world. The words are always simple. They do not speak of grand strategies or the turning tides of empires. They speak of birthdays celebrated, of weddings attended, of quiet, ordinary Tuesdays that were allowed to happen because a wooden boat refused to sink in the shallow water. Andrew reaches out and rests his heavy, tired hand on the stack of paper. He does not need to read them again tonight. He knows the feeling of the gratitude they carry. It is a feeling that settles deep into his weary bones, softer than any blanket, more comforting than any metal. He looks out toward the river. The water is perfectly black now, a dark mirror reflecting the silver scatter of a million southern stars. The river flows on, ancient and undisturbed, just as it did before he ever cut his first piece of timber, and just as it will long after he is gone. His name might not be carved into the cold, enduring stone of a grand monument. It might not be etched into the heavy iron of a great battleship. But as he listens to the gentle, rhythmic lap of the water against the muddy bank, a sound like a slow, peaceful heartbeat, he smiles in the dark. He knows that stone crumbles, and iron inevitably rusts. But water is the very essence of life. It flows into everything. It sustains the roots of the ancient trees, it nourishes the fields of the Midwest, and it connects the distant shores of the world. To have a name carved in water is not to be forgotten. It is to become part of the current. It is to dissolve into the very bloodstream of the families who lived, to flow quietly and peacefully through the generations, an invisible, sustaining force of life and grace. Andrew closes his eyes, letting the heavy, sweet air of the bayou wash over him. The frogs sing their ancient, throaty lullaby, and the cicadas hum their soothing rhythm. The old lumberman rests, surrounded by the shadows of the cypress trees and the quiet, unending flow of the river, perfectly at peace, holding on to the beautiful, fading memory of his wooden dreams, and drifting slowly, gently, into the comforting embrace of the night. Even the whitest circles, born from the heaviest stones, eventually smooth out into the quiet surface of a resting pond. Time is a gentle, forgiving river. It does not rush, and it does not judge. It simply flows, carrying away the sharp edges of our deepest fears, softening the memories of the darkest nights, and eventually, returning all things to a state of profound, natural rest. In the long, peaceful years that followed the great storm, the humid air of the Louisiana bayou slowly reclaimed its ancient silence. The massive, echoing boatyards of New Orleans, which had once thrummed with the desperate, urgent heartbeat of a nation, grew quiet. The towering corrugated sheds, where thousands of exhausted hands had shaped the destiny of the world out of sawdust and pine, were gradually dismantled or left to sleep in the southern sun. The deafening symphony of the circular saws, the heavy, rhythmic thud of the drop hammers, and the bright, blinding sparks of the welders all faded away, replaced once more by the soothing, eternal hum of the cicadas and the soft, morning calls of the turtle doves. Andrew was an older man now, walking through the twilight of his own extraordinary life. His hair had turned the color of the river fog, and the broad, powerful shoulders that had once carried the immense, crushing weight of a world at war now sloped with a gentle, deeply earned weariness. He no longer wore the heavy, dust-covered work boots of a frantic shipwright. He wore simple leather shoes, and he walked with a quiet, measured pace along the muddy banks of the water he loved so much. He would often sit on the wooden porch of his home as the evening sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of bruised purple, soft peach, and deep, resting indigo. He did not surround himself with grand medals, or polished marble statues, or the cold, rigid trophies of a conqueror. He knew, better than anyone, that true strength does not lie in things that are meant to last forever. True strength is found in the willingness to serve a fleeting, desperate moment, and then gracefully step back into the shadows. He thought of the boats. His wooden children. He knew where they were. They were scattered across the far, lonely corners of the earth. On the quiet, windswept beaches of northern France, and hidden within the emerald, tropical coves of the Pacific Islands, the Higgins boats were slowly returning to the earth. They had never been built of immortal steel. They had been built of Philippine mahogany and warm southern cypress, living with that understood the cycle of life. The salt spray and the unrelenting sun had bleached their dark, painted hulls into a pale, ghostly silver. The tides, day after day, year after year, washed gently over their flat bottoms, carrying away the scent of diesel fuel and gunpowder, replacing it with the clean, fresh perfume of kelp and ocean brine. The thick iron hinges of the great ramps rusted, seizing tight in a final, peaceful embrace. Small, colorful crabs made their homes in the shaded corners of the wooden ribs, and tired, wandering seabirds built their fragile nests on the heavy wooden steering wheels. Nature was gently, lovingly taking them back. The boats were dissolving into the sand, breaking down into beautiful, smooth pieces of silver driftwood that would one day wash ashore for a child to find, completely unaware of the terrifying, miraculous history resting in the palm of their small hand. Andrew found a profound, overwhelming peace in this. His boats had done exactly what they were meant to do. They had been the bridge over the darkest water, and now that the crossing was finished, the bridge could beautifully, quietly fade away. But the true legacy of the bayou was not carved in wood. It was carved in the beating hearts of the people who survived. Let us travel far away from the Louisiana marshes, to a quiet, warmly lit kitchen in a city apartment, many years after the world grew still. Standing at the counter is a woman named Clara. Her hands, once heavily wrapped in thick cotton bandages to protect them from the biting splinters and the harsh marine glue of the factory floor, are bare now. The calluses have faded, replaced by the soft, papery skin of a grandmother. She is gently kneading a bowl of dough, her movements rhythmic, soothing, and entirely at peace. Sitting at the small wooden table beside her is her grandson, a little boy with bright, curious eyes, working diligently on a drawing. Clara pauses her work, wiping a dusting of white flour from her forehead, and looks down at him. A slow, warm smile spreads across her face. She remembers the terrifying, exhausting nights under the harsh, amber glow of the arc lamps. She remembers the tears she secretly cried into the sawdust as she sanded the holes, praying that her own son would find his way back from the deep water. And he did. He came home, changed, quieted, but alive. Because he lived, this little boy sitting at her table was able to be born. Clara reaches out and gently touches the top of her grandson's head. She knows, with a quiet, fierce certainty, that the true masterpiece she built in that factory was not a wooden boat. It was the laughter filling her kitchen today. It was the continuation of life. It was a victory won not with weapons, but with the unrelenting, protective love of a mother's hands. And then, let us think of a man named Thomas. Thomas was once a terrified, shivering farm boy who learned to breathe in the sharp salt air while gripping the mahogany wheel of a Higgins boat. He is an old man now, walking slowly along the edge of a quiet, freshwater lake in the American Midwest. The autumn air is crisp, carrying the scent of fallen pine needles and damp earth. He stops by the water's edge and looks out across the gentle ripples. He closes his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he is no longer on a peaceful lake. He is back in the suffocating darkness of the wooden hull, listening to the terrified breathing of the boy standing shoulder to shoulder behind him. He feels the heavy, shuddering impact of the flat bottom striking the coral reef. He remembers the agonizing, metallic whine of the steel cables lowering the ramp and the blinding, terrifying light that flooded in. But the memory does not bring him panic anymore. It brings him a deep, humbling sorrow for the boys who did not walk back up the beach, and an overwhelming, breathless gratitude for the simple, unassuming wooden walls that kept him alive. He crouches down, his old knees popping softly in the cool air, and rests his hand on the surface of the lake. The water is cold and clear. He whispers a quiet, private thank you into the wind. A thank you to the water that carried him, a thank you to the unyielding spirit of the boys beside him, and a thank you to the unknown, invisible carpenters of the South who poured their souls into the timber that brought him home. It is a remarkably fragile thing, the memory of the past. Like the wooden boats themselves, the stories of these quiet heroes, these everyday moments of unimaginable resilience, are always at risk of fading away into the sand, washed out by the relentless tide of time. History is so often dominated by the loud, sweeping narratives of empires, leaving the gentle, human whispers to be forgotten. Gathering these whispers, sifting through the dust of the years to find the small, beautiful moments of kindness, fear, and love, requires a profound dedication. It takes countless hours of careful, loving research to ensure that the sacrifices of people like Clara, Thomas, and Andrew are never truly lost to the dark. If you find a sense of peace in these gentle walks through the past, if you feel a connection to the quiet dignity of the people who held the world together with their bare hands, I would be so incredibly grateful if you might consider leaving a small tip, even as little as $1, on our Ko-Fi page. Your kindness is the foundation that supports the massive amount of time it takes to carefully weave these stories together, allowing us to keep this sanctuary of memory alive and warm. Please, to keep yourself safe, only use the secure link I've placed in the description below. If you try to search for this on the internet, the top results are unfortunately often fake websites designed to scam you, and I want to make sure you are protected. It is your presence, your willingness to sit quietly and listen, that gives these ghosts of the past a place to finally rest. As the final light of the sun slips beneath the horizon, the Louisiana bayou settles into its deepest, most comforting slumber. Andrew sits on his porch, the warm, heavy air wrapping around him like a familiar, protective blanket. He closes his eyes and listens. He does not hear the roar of the engines or the frantic, desperate calls of a world on fire. He hears only the gentle, ancient breathing of the earth. He thinks of the millions of young men who stepped off his wooden ramps and onto the shores of history. He thinks of the sheer, staggering weight of the lives that were saved, the generations that were allowed to bloom, all because a stubborn man refused to let go of a simple, beautiful idea. He had faced the deafening silence of the brass, the cold, marble rejection of the powerful, and the impossible, terrifying currents of a fractured world. And he had answered them all with the quiet, honest truth of the wood. The great factories are gone. The tools are rusted. The boats have melted back into the oceans. But the ripples of what they achieved are still moving outward, touching the shores of our lives today. Every peaceful morning, every quiet evening, every laugh shared around a kitchen table in a world free from the shadows of that terrible storm is a gentle echo of the work done in the humid, dusty sheds of New Orleans. Andrew takes a slow, deep breath, filling his lungs with the sweet scent of the jasmine and the river mud. A profound, unbreakable peace settles over his tired heart. His journey is complete. The burden has been lifted. Down by the muddy bank, a small, silver fish breaks the surface of the dark water, catching the pale, milky light of the rising moon. It leaves behind a single, perfect circle on the water. The ripple spreads outward, moving slowly and gracefully across the glass-like surface of the bayou, carrying the quiet, enduring spirit of the swamp. It travels toward the reeds, toward the ancient, sleeping cypress trees, and finally, gently, it meets the shore, smoothing out into nothingness, leaving behind a world perfectly, beautifully at rest. Good night.